My family always laughed at my career, calling it playing nurse. At my older brother's lavish lake party, his 6-year-old son went under the water. I had him breathing before the ambulance even arrived. Later at the hospital, the chief of emergency medicine saw me and stopped dead in his tracks. He looked absolutely frantic until he locked eyes with me and said, "Doctor, why are you sitting out here in the waiting room?" My mother's head snapped toward me so fast I thought her neck would break. She had just introduced me to the triage desk as the babysitter. My name is Vanessa and I am 34 years old. For a decade, I let my family believe I was a disappointment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of people who should have been your biggest supporters. The exhaustion in my bones was heavy and absolute. I had just finished a brutal 48-hour shift at the hospital, running back-to-back trauma surgeries that blurred the line between day and night. The drive to my brother Cameron's sprawling lakeside estate in upstate New York should have been a time to decompress, but my stomach was already tied in knots. Family gatherings were never relaxing for me. They were battlegrounds disguised as barbecues. Cameron had recently purchased the summer property, and this weekend was his grand unveiling to his inner circle of wealthy finance friends and potential investors. The driveway was lined with imported luxury cars gleaming under the bright afternoon sun. I parked my reliable, unassuming sedan at the very end of the gravel path, too exhausted to care about the glaring contrast it made against the shiny sports cars. I grabbed my overnight bag from the trunk, rubbing the back of my neck to ease the tension, and made my way up the winding stone path to the massive deck overlooking the water. The air was thick with the smell of expensive catered food and the sound of loud, entitled laughter. Music pulsed from hidden outdoor speakers. I had not even set my bag down on the deck chair when my mother Beatrice materialized out of the crowd. She was wearing a crisp white linen suit, holding a flute of champagne, and looking at me with that familiar expression of mild distaste. Without a word of greeting, without asking how my drive was or how I was doing, she shoved a thick stack of cheap plastic bibs and a roll of paper towels into my chest. "You are late, Vanessa," she said, her voice sharp and carrying easily over the music. "The children are getting hungry, and they are making an absolute mess over by the patio." I blinked, the fatigue making me momentarily slow to process the command. "Mom, I just worked a 48-hour shift. I drove straight here. I have not even had a glass of water yet." Beatrice rolled her eyes, letting out a dramatic sigh, as she turned slightly to ensure Cameron's wealthy investor friends were listening. She pitched her voice louder, a performative laugh bubbling from her throat. "Oh, please. Vanessa is playing nurse down at the city clinic. She deals with messes all day long. We thought she would be absolutely perfect to watch the kids today while the adults talk business. Come along now, do not be difficult." The group of men and women standing near her chuckled. A few of them cast pitying glances in my direction, taking in my plain clothes and my tired face, clearly dismissing me as the family charity case. My sister-in-law, Whitney, walked past holding a cocktail, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and a smirk that told me she had orchestrated this entire humiliation. I stood there with the plastic bibs pressed against my chest. The urge to drop them on the imported teak deck and walk right back to my car was overwhelming. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them that I was not playing nurse at a clinic. I wanted to announce that I was the director of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, saving lives, while they shuffled imaginary money around in their finance portfolios. But I looked past the deck and saw my 6-year-old nephew Leo sitting at a low plastic table. He looked small and overwhelmed by the noise of the party, pushing a piece of watermelon around his paper plate. I took a slow, deep breath. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. I would not cause a scene. I would not ruin a summer afternoon for the kids by screaming at my mother and brother. I forced my lips into a polite, neutral smile, gripping the plastic bibs tightly. "If you need me, I will be with the children," I said quietly. Beatrice had already turned her back to me, engaging an investor in a conversation about yacht rentals. I walked away, feeling the burning stares of her friends on my back, and made my way down to the patio where the kids were gathered. As I sat down next to Leo and began tying a plastic bib around his neck, The familiar sting of their rejection washed over me. It was a sting I had carried for 10 long years. The gap between my reality and their perception of me was a chasm they had dug themselves. It started back when I was accepted into Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I had worked myself to the bone to get in, sacrificing my social life, my sleep, and my youth to achieve my dream of becoming a surgeon. When the day of my medical school graduation finally arrived, I had reserved front row seats for my family. I waited in the auditorium watching other students hug their proud parents, holding bouquets of flowers and wiping away tears of joy. My family never showed up. I sat alone in my graduation gown, checking my phone obsessively. An hour after the ceremony ended, I finally received a text from Cameron. He had closed a major real estate deal that morning, and Beatrice had decided they all needed to go to an expensive celebratory lunch in Manhattan to honor his achievement. My mother had texted me shortly after saying, "It is just a school ceremony, Vanessa. Cameron's career is taking off. We need to support him. You understand?" I understood perfectly. In the hierarchy of the Cole family, Cameron's financial status was the only currency that mattered. My grueling medical education, the thousands of hours of study, the crushing pressure of surgical rotations, all of it was invisible to them because it did not come with immediate flashy wealth they could brag about at their country club. After that day, I simply stopped trying. I stopped updating them on my life. I stopped telling them about my surgical fellowship, about the groundbreaking research I was publishing, about the promotions that came rapidly as I proved my skill in the operating room. When they asked what I was doing, I gave vague answers. I told them I was working in healthcare in the city. They assumed I was a low-level clinic worker, and they never bothered to ask questions that would prove them wrong. They built a narrative where Cameron was the golden child bringing glory to the family name, and I was the disappointing spinster who wiped noses and cleaned bedpans. I let them believe it because their ignorance was my shield. It protected my actual life from their toxic interference and relentless status checking. Aunt Vanessa, Leo said softly, pulling me out of my memories. He tugged at my sleeve. "Can I have more juice, please?" "Of course, buddy." I smiled, pouring apple juice into his plastic cup. He gave me a gap-toothed grin that warmed my heart. Leo was the only reason I still attended these family events. He was a sweet, observant boy, entirely different from his pretentious parents. As I reached across the table to wipe a spill, the sleeve of my simple cotton cardigan rode up slightly. Beneath the cheap fabric sat a custom limited edition designer watch that cost more than Cameron's luxury car parked in the driveway. I quickly pulled the sleeve back down, making sure the watch was hidden from view. I did not need to wear my success to know it was real. While Whitney and Beatrice spent their afternoons gossiping and spending Cameron's money, I was saving children's lives. While Cameron mocked me for being poor, I was sitting on a massive fortune built from my own surgical expertise. Just 3 days ago, I had closed on a $4 million penthouse in the city, paying entirely in cash. I sat quietly at the children's table, cutting up hot dogs and wiping sticky fingers, perfectly content in my silence. The loud music thumped from the upper deck, mixing with the obnoxious laughter of adults who thought they ruled the world. I watched them congratulate themselves, completely unaware of the reality sitting just a few yards away. "Let them think I am the babysitter," I thought to myself, smoothing down Leo's unruly hair. Their delusions did not change the truth. I was an accomplished pediatric trauma surgeon, highly respected in my field, and completely financially independent. The truth was my armor against their constant petty humiliations. The afternoon sun beat down on the surface of the lake, making the water sparkle with a deceptive, inviting warmth. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the children, meticulously tracking their movements, ensuring they stayed well away from the deep end of the floating wooden dock. The adults on the upper deck were entirely distracted now, their voices slurring with expensive champagne and unearned arrogance. They truly believed they were invincible, insulated by their money and their social status. But working in a pediatric trauma center had taught me a harsh, undeniable truth about the world. Disaster never announces itself with a warning. It does not care about your bank account, your luxury cars, or your country club memberships. It simply strikes tearing through the fragile illusion of safety in a matter of terrifying seconds, leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. I adjusted the cheap plastic chair I was sitting on, feeling the hard plastic dig into my tired back. I took another slow sip of my lukewarm water, forcing myself to remain alert, despite the bone-deep exhaustion pulling at my eyelids. I watched the water rippling gently against the wooden planks of the dock. The rhythmic sound should have been relaxing, a peaceful summer melody. Instead, a deep instinctive chill ran down my spine. The kind of cold dread that every trauma surgeon learns to recognize, the silent, invisible weight in the air just before everything goes wrong. The sharp clinking of ice against crystal drew my attention away from the water. Whitney, my sister-in-law, was descending the cedar stairs from the upper deck, flanked by two women dripping in designer labels. Whitney moved with the exaggerated grace of someone who desperately wanted to be noticed. She wore a silk cover-up that likely cost a month of a resident's salary, her oversized sunglasses shielding her eyes, but not her condescension. They paused just a few feet from the children's table where I sat. Whitney did not acknowledge me directly. Instead, she pitched her voice to that specific carrying volume meant for an audience. "It is just such a shame," Whitney sighed, swirling her cocktail. "Cameron and I were so hoping to have the whole family for the yacht charter in Monaco next month. We secured the most stunning vessel, 120 feet fully staffed. But you know how it is. We asked Vanessa to chip in a mere $5,000 for her share of the provisions, and well, it was just too much for her." One of her friends cast a sidelong glance at me, her expression a mix of pity and discomfort. $5,000 is not exactly a small amount for someone working in a public clinic, the friend murmured, trying to be diplomatic. Whitney let out a breathy, dismissive laugh. "Oh, I know. I told Cameron we should just pay for her out of charity. But you know how stubborn people get about accepting handouts. We cannot force her to live our lifestyle. It is just sad, really. She works so hard for pennies. I suppose someone has to do the grunt work in those city clinics, but it really puts a damper on family vacations when one person simply cannot keep up." I focused entirely on wiping a smear of ketchup from the plastic table, my expression a mask of absolute serenity. Whitney wanted a reaction. She wanted me to flush with embarrassment, to shrink into myself, or perhaps to lash out so she could play the victim of her aggressive, jealous sister-in-law. I refused to give her the satisfaction. The truth was almost comical. $5,000 was a fraction of what I typically donated to the pediatric burn unit every quarter. The idea of being trapped on a yacht for a week with Whitney and Cameron sounded like a psychological torture experiment, not a vacation. When they had sent the group text demanding contributions for the charter, I had simply replied that my schedule would not allow it. Whitney had immediately spun that into a narrative of my financial ruin. I let her spin it. If thinking I was broke made her feel better about her own hollow existence, that was her burden to carry. Vanessa. The sharp bark of my name broke through my thoughts. I looked up to see Cameron standing at the edge of the driveway, waving me over with an impatient flick of his wrist. He was dressed in pristine white linen pants and a navy polo, holding a cigar he likely did not even know how to smoke properly. He looked every inch the successful finance mogul he pretended to be. I patted Leo on the shoulder, told him to finish his fruit, and walked across the manicured lawn toward my brother. The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on the driveway, baking the gravel. As I approached, I noticed Cameron was sweating profusely, though whether from the heat or the alcohol I could not be sure. "What is it, Cameron?" I asked, keeping my voice even and polite. He pointed an accusatory finger toward the far end of the circular driveway. "What is that doing there?" I followed his gaze. Parked neatly at the end of the line of modern sports cars and massive luxury SUVs was my car. It was a fully restored classic, a vintage masterpiece I had spent 2 years and a small fortune having meticulously rebuilt by a specialist in Germany. The engine purred like a sleeping panther, the interior was custom leather, and the paint job was a flawless, deep midnight blue. To anyone who knew anything about automobiles, it was a rare collector's dream. To Cameron, whose idea of automotive excellence was whatever had the most expensive modern badge plastered on the front grille, it was just an old car. "That is my car," I said simply. I know it is your car, Vanessa, he snapped, rubbing his forehead. That is the problem. I have important investors here today. People who manage portfolios worth hundreds of millions. I have a photographer coming in an hour to take drone shots of the estate for a lifestyle magazine feature. I cannot have that absolute beater ruining the aesthetic of my driveway. It makes the whole place look like a junkyard. I stared at him, genuinely fascinated by his ignorance. A junkyard. I need you to move it, he demanded, stepping closer and lowering his voice so his guests would not hear. Take it down the service road and park it behind the maintenance shed. You can walk back up. I cannot have my partners looking out the window and thinking I have relatives who drive scrap metal. It is embarrassing. I looked at my brother. Beneath his expensive cologne and designer clothes, I saw the frayed edges of his facade. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them tight with stress. During my 48-hour shifts, I dealt with people in genuine crisis. Cameron was in crisis too, though he would never admit it. I had friends in the financial sector in the city. The whispers about Cameron's firm had started months ago. The aggressive leveraging, the risky commercial real estate investments that were tanking, the desperate scrambling for new capital to cover existing debts. He was bleeding money, putting up a front of massive wealth to attract the very investors standing on his deck right now. He was a man standing on a trapdoor holding the rope that would drop it. You want me to park in the woods so your friends do not see my car, I clarified, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Do not play dumb, Vanessa. Cameron sneered, leaning in closer. His breath smelled of stale champagne and anxiety. Look, I get it. You made your choices. You had a real chance when you got into that fancy medical school. You could have been a plastic surgeon, a dermatologist, someone who actually makes real money. Instead, you dropped out of your big medical dreams to go wipe noses and pass out bandages at some free clinic. He took a drag of his cigar, blowing the smoke to the side. You chose to be a failure. You chose this mediocre, pathetic life, but I did not. I am building an empire here. I am operating at a level you cannot even comprehend. So I am asking you as a favor to the brother who is generous enough to invite you to his estate, move the junker out of sight. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I just smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that seemed to unsettle him deeply. My choice of career, my supposed failure, was the bedrock of his superiority complex. He needed me to be a failure so his own precarious success felt more solid. He needed to mock my clinic job because facing the reality of his own hollow achievements was too terrifying. What Cameron did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had not dropped out of my medical dreams. I had conquered them. I had graduated at the absolute top of my class. I had completed the most rigorous elite surgical fellowship in the country. I was currently the director of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery at Memorial Hospital, one of the top-ranked trauma centers in the nation. I held patents on surgical instruments I had developed. I commanded a salary that dwarfed the imaginary numbers Cameron projected to his investors. And just 3 days ago, I had signed the final paperwork on a spectacular penthouse overlooking Central Park. I had paid $4 million for it. In cash. I had zero debt. I had zero leveraging. I owned everything I had free and clear earned through my own skill, dedication, and blood. Cameron was standing on the edge of bankruptcy, demanding I hide a vintage car worth more than his entire liquid asset portfolio because he thought I was poor. The irony was so rich, so incredibly satisfying, that I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. I did not need to defend myself. Defending myself would require valuing his opinion, and I valued his opinion about as much as I valued the dirt beneath my shoes. Sure, Cameron, I said softly, my voice completely devoid of the anger he was trying to provoke. I will move my car out of your sight. I would hate to ruin the beautiful image you are trying so hard to project. He blinked, caught off guard by my easy compliance. He had wanted an argument. He wanted me to act defensive to prove that his insults had landed. My calm agreement threw him off balance. Right, he muttered, adjusting his collar. Just put it behind the shed, and then get back to the kids. Leo is supposed to have his allergy medication soon. Make sure you do your job. I nodded once, turning my back on him. I pulled my keys from my pocket and walked toward the midnight blue classic car. As I slid into the custom leather seat and turned the ignition, the engine roared to life with a deep, resonant growl that turned the heads of several investors on the deck. I saw a few of the older men, the ones who actually understood wealth rather than just the appearance of it, point at my car with clear admiration. I put the car in gear and drove slowly down the driveway, following Cameron's instructions to hide my vehicle behind the maintenance shed. As I parked in the shadow of the trees, I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet for a moment. The air was still. I looked at my hands resting on the steering wheel. These hands had repaired tiny, fragile hearts. These hands had pulled children back from the brink of death. These hands had built a life of absolute substance integrity and monumental success. Cameron and Whitney could have their loud conversations. They could have their rented yachts, their leveraged estates, and their desperate need to feel superior. I had the truth, and the truth was a quiet, unshakable fortress that their petty insults could never penetrate. I grabbed my water bottle, locked the car, and began the walk back up the gravel path toward the lawn. The heat was oppressive, the kind of heavy, humid summer air that presses down on your chest. I could hear the music from the deck growing louder as I approached the backyard again. I needed to get back to the children's table. I needed to check on Leo. As I rounded the corner of the house, the view of the lake opened up before me. The water was still glittering under the sun. The adults were still drinking on the upper deck, their laughter echoing across the lawn. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. Everything looked like a perfect, wealthy summer afternoon. But as I walked back toward the plastic chairs, my medical instincts flared. That silent, invisible weight dropped into the air again. The heavy, cold dread of a trauma surgeon walking into a disaster zone. I picked up my pace, my eyes scanning the patio, the lawn, the floating wooden dock. The world was still turning, but the countdown had already begun. I walked back onto the manicured green grass, my eyes immediately seeking out the children's table. There were 4 kids in total. Cameron's business partner had brought his 2 young daughters, and then there was Leo and his younger cousin. As I approached the plastic table, I noticed the sharp, unsettling contrast between the peaceful lower lawn and the escalating chaos on the upper cedar deck. The volume of the expensive outdoor sound system had been turned up drastically since I had walked down the driveway. A heavy rhythmic bass line vibrated through the patio stones beneath my feet. Up above, the party had crossed the line from a sophisticated summer gathering to a sloppy, intoxicated spectacle. I could hear Whitney's shrill voice cutting through the loud music. She was arguing fiercely with Cameron about a spilled glass of vintage champagne that was currently soaking into the expensive outdoor rug. Cameron was shouting back at her, his face flushed red, gesturing wildly with his empty crystal glass. Beatrice was trying to intervene, not to calm them down, but to hush them, so the wealthy investors would not notice the massive cracks in their perfect marriage. The investors themselves were completely distracted, gathered around the outdoor bar, laughing too loudly and clinking glasses. Nobody was looking at the water. Nobody was paying attention to the children. The absolute negligence made my jaw clench tight. In my emergency room, I saw the horrifying aftermath of afternoons exactly like this one. Distracted parents, open bodies of water, and a false sense of security fueled by alcohol. I quickly counted the heads at the small plastic table. 1, 2, 3. My heart skipped a heavy beat. I blinked, stepping closer, my eyes darting around the immediate vicinity of the patio. The 2 girls were busy drawing with crayons. The younger cousin was playing with a plastic toy truck in the grass. Leo was entirely gone. "Where is Leo?" I asked the little girl closest to me, keeping my voice perfectly steady to avoid alarming her. She shrugged without looking up from her coloring book. "He went to look at the boats," she mumbled. My gaze snapped immediately to the shoreline. The property sloped down to a small private beach, which connected to a long floating wooden dock extending 50 feet out into the lake. Cameron had 2 jet skis and a small speedboat tied securely to the metal cleats. The late afternoon sun was glaring off the water, creating a harsh, blinding reflection that made it incredibly difficult to see clearly. I broke into a jog, my eyes scanning the shoreline, the shallow water, the length of the wooden dock. Nothing. The dock was completely empty. I looked back up at the deck. Whitney was still screaming at Cameron. The music was deafening. If a 6-year-old boy fell into the water, he would panic. He would thrash violently. He would cry out for his mother. But over the heavy bass and the drunken arguing of the adults, a splash would be entirely silenced. A desperate scream would be completely swallowed by the surrounding noise. A child can drown in total silence in less than 60 seconds. I reached the edge of the grass and stepped onto the wooden planks of the dock. The wood swayed slightly under my weight. I looked down. At the very edge of the floating platform, right between the two tied-up jet skis, lay a small, bright red plastic toy car. It was the exact same car Leo had been holding at the lunch table just minutes ago. The dock was still bobbing a subtle, rhythmic motion that indicated the water surface had very recently been disturbed by a shifting weight. I stepped to the edge and looked directly down into the lake. The water here was deep and incredibly murky, dyed a dark, impenetrable green by the summer algae and the silty lake bottom. I could not see past the first 2 feet. I did not yell for help. Yelling would waste precious oxygen. Yelling would alert a group of intoxicated, panicking adults who would only get in my way and waste critical seconds. My medical training instantly overrode my fear. Adrenaline flooded my system, sharpening my focus to a razor edge. I was no longer the dismissed sister or the mocked babysitter. I was the director of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery, and the clock was ticking. I kicked off my sneakers, not even bothering to untie the laces. I threw my phone onto the dry wood of the dock. I took one massive lung, expanding breath, filling my chest with as much oxygen as my body could hold, and I dove directly into the dark water between the heavy fiberglass hulls of the jet skis. The impact was a massive shock of freezing cold. The oppressive summer heat vanished instantly, replaced by a biting chill that immediately tried to force the precious air from my lungs. The transition from the loud, chaotic world above to the absolute suffocating silence below was jarring. Down here there was no thumping bass, no arguing adults, no glaring sunshine. There was only the thick, heavy pressure of the lake and a terrifying, impenetrable darkness that surrounded me on all sides. The contrast was absolutely horrifying. Above me, my family was drinking champagne and complaining about money. Below the surface, my 6-year-old nephew was fighting a losing battle against the dark water. I opened my eyes, but the murky green water stung and offered almost zero visibility. It was exactly like swimming through thick pea soup. I had to rely entirely on touch and spatial awareness. I kicked my legs forcefully, propelling myself deeper toward the silty bottom of the lake. My hands swept through the water in wide, frantic arcs. I felt the slimy, algae-covered fiberglass hull of the nearest jet ski. I pushed past it, kicking harder, forcing myself down into the colder thermoclines of the water. The pressure built steadily in my ears, but I completely ignored the discomfort. My brain was rapidly calculating the grim physiological reality of pediatric drowning. A child's mammalian diving reflex could sometimes buy a little extra time, shunting oxygenated blood to the brain and the heart, but in warm summer water that survival reflex was significantly weaker. Every single second that passed without oxygen meant the potential for irreversible cellular death in the brain. The human brain can only survive a few minutes without oxygen before permanent neurological damage occurs. I knew the statistics intimately. I had delivered the devastating news to countless grieving parents in sterile hospital waiting rooms. I refused to let my brother and sister-in-law become those parents today. Every passing moment was an absolute eternity. I swept my arms wider, kicking blindly through the thick silt that my own frantic movements were stirring up from the bottom. My fingers brushed against something soft and yielding, a dense cluster of tall lake weeds. I ripped right through them, pushing myself laterally beneath the massive shadow of the wooden dock. The water temperature dropped further here, hidden from the warming rays of the sun. The heavy wooden pilings appeared as dark, looming shadows in the aquatic gloom. I navigated carefully around a thick algae-coated post, my lungs beginning to burn with the primal, desperate demand for fresh air. The carbon dioxide building up in my bloodstream was screaming at my brain to inhale, to take a breath, even if that breath was full of water. I ruthlessly suppressed the powerful urge to gasp. I commanded my body to hold steady. I was a surgeon. I was rigorously trained to operate under extreme physiological and psychological stress. I could not afford to fail here. Panic was a luxury I simply did not have. I swam further beneath the oppressive shadow of the floating dock. The darkness in this space was almost absolute. I was operating purely on instinct and tactile feedback, feeling my way through the cold void. I swept my right arm out through the freezing water, extending my reach as far as my shoulder would physically allow. My hand hit something solid. It was not a wooden piling. It was not a fiberglass boat hull. It yielded slightly under my searching touch. It was wet fabric. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, echoing loudly in my own ears. I grabbed the soaked fabric and pulled hard. A small, limp weight followed the motion. I pulled harder, sliding my freezing hands up the fabric until my fingers brushed against a small, motionless shoulder. I had him. I wrapped my arm firmly around Leo's small chest, pinning him securely against my side. His body felt terrifyingly relaxed in the water, completely devoid of any muscle tension or vital struggle. The utter stillness of his small form was the absolute worst possible clinical sign. I planted my bare feet firmly against the muddy, slippery bottom of the lake, bent my knees deep and pushed upward with every single ounce of strength I had left in my oxygen-starved body, propelling us upward toward the warm surface of the lake, praying desperately for a miracle. I broke the surface of the lake with a violent gasp, my lungs burning as I dragged the heavy summer air into my chest. The sudden brightness of the afternoon sun was blinding after the crushing darkness of the water, but I did not blink. I tightened my grip on Leo and kicked furiously toward the wooden edge of the dock. My muscles screamed in protest, flooded with lactic acid, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I reached the edge and shoved Leo upward. His small body slid onto the rough cedar planks with a wet, heavy thud. I hoisted myself up immediately behind him, scraping my knees against the wood, and scrambled to his side. The loud music from the upper deck was still blaring, a mocking soundtrack. I dropped to my knees beside my nephew. The visual assessment took less than a second, and the clinical reality was devastating. Leo was entirely cyanotic. His lips were a terrifying shade of slate blue, and the ashen pallor extended across his cheeks. His chest was perfectly still. There was no rise and fall, no sign of respiratory effort. I placed 2 fingers flat against his carotid artery. I waited for 5 agonizing seconds. Nothing. There was absolutely no pulse. The profound silence within his circulatory system was the most deafening sound I had ever experienced. The lake water pooled around his small frame, soaking into the expensive outdoor rug. I did not waste a millisecond calling for help. Crying would not oxygenate his brain, and the intoxicated adults would only bring chaos. I straddled his hips, interlaced my fingers, placed the heel of my hand precisely on the lower half of his sternum, and locked my elbows tight. I drove my weight downward, initiating the first aggressive chest compression. 1, 2, 3, 4. I counted silently, maintaining a perfect rapid rhythm of 100 to 120 compressions per minute. The exertion was immense, but my form was flawless. I was completely calibrated by a decade of saving pediatric trauma victims. 5, 6, 7, 8. I compressed his chest by exactly 2 inches, allowing for full chest recoil after every single thrust to ensure maximum venous return to his failing heart. 9, 10, 11, 12. It was only then that the illusion of the perfect summer party finally shattered. Someone on the upper deck looked down. A glass shattered against the wooden railing. Then came the scream. It was a raw, primal shriek that tore through the heavy bass of the music. Whitney had seen us. Her scream ripped through the air, instantly silencing the idle chatter of the wealthy investors. The music was abruptly cut off. Footsteps thundered down the wooden cedar stairs like a stampede. Cameron reached the patio first, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He stumbled over a plastic chair, sending it skidding across the stones. Whitney was right behind him, shrieking her son's name in a pitch that made my ears ring. Beatrice, trailing behind them with a champagne flute still clutched in her trembling hand, took one look at Leo's blue face, let out a breathless gasp, and collapsed completely, fainting dead away onto the manicured grass. Nobody moved to help her. Cameron dropped to his knees on the dock, his hands hovering uselessly over Leo. "What did you do?" Cameron screamed at me, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "What did you do to him?" Whitney threw herself forward, her manicured hands clawing at my shoulders. "Stop touching him!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You are hurting him. You are just a clinic nurse. Get away from my baby." I ignored them completely. 13, 14, 15, 16. I leaned over, pinched Leo's nose, shut, tilted his chin back to open his airway, and delivered 2 precise rescue breaths. I watched his chest rise, then immediately went back to compressions. 17, 18, 19. I did not have the time or the oxygen to explain the mechanics of cardiopulmonary resuscitation to them. Whitney grabbed my arm, trying to physically wrench me away from her son. I shoved her back with a violent thrust of my elbow, never breaking my rhythm. "Do not touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that cut right through her hysteria. "Stand back right now or you will kill him." Whitney stumbled backward, shocked by the sheer force of my command. Cameron was frozen, hyperventilating, completely useless in the face of genuine trauma. 20, 21, 22. The crowd of investors had gathered at the edge of the grass, murmuring in horrified whispers, completely paralyzed by the spectacle. Suddenly, a man pushed aggressively through the crowd. It was Cameron's neighbor, a college-aged guy wearing board shorts and a tank top. "I am a lifeguard," he yelled, sprinting onto the dock. He dropped to his knees on the opposite side of Leo and reached out, trying to shove my hands away from Leo's sternum. "Let me take over. You are going too fast. You are going to break his ribs. You need to clear the water from his lungs first." I did not yield a single inch. I kept my hands locked on Leo's chest, driving down with relentless, calculated force. My eyes snapped up to the neighbor, locking onto his with absolute terrifying authority. "Back off," I barked, my voice echoing like a gunshot across the quiet lake. "I am performing high-quality pediatric CPR. Do not interrupt my compressions." The neighbor blinked, taken aback by my tone, but his ego immediately flared up. "Lady, I am certified," he argued, reaching for Leo again. "You are doing it wrong. You have to turn him on his side." The sheer incompetence of his outdated training enraged me. I did not just speak, I unleashed the full, intimidating weight of a chief attending surgeon. "Listen to me very carefully." I snapped, my voice ringing with hard, undeniable medical authority. "This is a hypoxic arrest resulting in severe bradycardia and subsequent asystole. Turning him on his side will do absolutely nothing but delay systemic perfusion. I am pumping residual oxygenated blood to his cerebral cortex to prevent irreversible anoxic brain injury. If you interrupt my coronary perfusion pressure for even 2 seconds, his brain cells will begin to die. Do you understand me?" The neighbor froze, his hands suspended in the air. His mouth hung open. The technical vocabulary, the absolute certainty in my voice, and the aggressive command presence hit him like a physical blow. He realized instantly that he was completely out of his depth. He was a community pool lifeguard. I was a highly trained specialist who cracked open chests for a living. "What do I do?" he stammered, all his previous arrogance completely vanishing. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, ready to follow any order I gave. "I need you useful," I commanded, never stopping my compressions. 30. 1, 2. Position yourself at his head. Do a jaw thrust maneuver. Keep his airway completely open and unobstructed. When I pause for breaths, you watch for chest rise. Do it now. The neighbor quickly scrambled up to the top of Leo's head, placing his hands exactly where I directed, elevating the jaw to secure the airway. "Good," I said firmly, keeping my focus locked on Leo's chest. I delivered 2 more breaths. The neighbor watched the chest rise and fall, nodding frantically. We settled into a grueling high-stakes rhythm. My shoulders burned, my lower back ached, and my wet clothes clung heavily to my skin, but I did not slow down. I poured every ounce of my strength, my training, and my willpower into the small boy lying on the wooden dock. Cameron and Whitney were weeping openly now, clinging to each other in the grass, utterly helpless. The minutes stretched out, agonizing and infinite. In the distance, cutting through the heavy summer air, a faint, high-pitched wail began to echo down the lake road. Sirens. They were approaching fast. But I knew the paramedics were still too far away. I had to keep the blood flowing. I had to keep the brain alive. 71, 72, 73. Suddenly, under the heel of my hand, I felt a slight flutter. It was faint, irregular, and chaotic, but it was there. I paused my compressions for exactly 3 seconds, pressing my fingers to his carotid artery. A pulse. It was thready, racing like a trapped bird, but it was a genuine, spontaneous pulse. In the next second, Leo convulsed. His chest heaved and he rolled onto his side, coughing up a massive surge of dark lake water. He gasped, drawing a ragged breath, starting to cry. It was a weak sound, but the most beautiful noise in the world. He was breathing. He was alive. The sirens screamed louder, tearing down the driveway, but I already had him back. Heavy boots thundered across the manicured lawn. The frantic wail of the approaching sirens abruptly cut off, instantly replaced by the chaotic flashing of red and blue emergency lights, reflecting harshly against the massive glass windows of Cameron's lakeside estate. 2 young paramedics sprinted down the wooden cedar stairs, with relentless urgency, carrying a bright yellow jump bag, a heavy oxygen tank, and a collapsible stretcher. The wood of the floating dock groaned and swayed violently under their combined weight as they rushed toward us. I kept my hand resting gently but firmly against Leo's small chest, feeling the rapid, thready rhythm of his heart beating rapidly against my wet palm. He was coughing weakly, sputtering up more murky lake water, his small hands clutching blindly at the soaked fabric of my shirt. His skin was still terrifyingly pale, and his lips held a dangerous blue tint, but he was drawing breath. He was fighting. I had pulled him back from the absolute brink of permanent darkness. In the exact moment the paramedics dropped to their knees beside us, the paralyzing shock that had completely immobilized Whitney finally shattered. Her profound terror instantly mutated into an aggressive, hysterical rage. She lunged forward, her expensive designer silk cover-up billowing wildly behind her. Without a single word of warning, she drove her perfectly manicured hands hard into my wet shoulders. The physical shove was violent, reckless, and completely unexpected. My bare feet slipped against the slick, algae-coated cedar planks, and I was thrown backward with intense force, my hips slamming painfully against the hard fiberglass hull of the nearby jet ski. "Do not touch him!" Whitney shrieked, her face contorted with sheer panic and unhinged fury. She threw herself over Leo, sobbing hysterically, completely blocking the highly trained paramedics from accessing his compromised airway. "Get your hands off my son right now. You are just a pathetic clinic nurse. You probably broke his ribs with all that aggressive pushing. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing to him." I caught myself against the jet ski, feeling a sharp flare of pain radiate down my leg. I slowly pushed myself back up to a standing position, the lake water pooling around my feet, my wet clothes clinging heavily to my shivering body. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to her physical assault. I simply looked down at her with absolute, unwavering clinical detachment. The sheer audacity of her accusation was astounding to me. I had just cracked her son's chest with perfect life-saving precision. Breaking a child's ribs during aggressive cardiopulmonary resuscitation is a known entirely acceptable risk when the only alternative is certain brain death. I had saved his cerebral cortex from permanent anoxic injury while she was busy screaming at her husband over spilled champagne on an outdoor rug. Before the paramedics could even attempt to gently move Whitney aside to properly assess their critical patient, Cameron charged forward. The absolute terror he had felt moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, aggressive need to deflect all possible blame away from himself. He stormed right up to me, aggressively invading my personal space, his chest heaving with exertion and panic. His face was a mask of unhinged anger. "I am going to sue you for everything you have," Cameron roared, jabbing a trembling accusatory finger directly into my face. "You had one simple job today, Vanessa. One job. You were supposed to be watching the kids. We gave you the bibs. We told you to stay with them while we entertained our guests. You let my son wander off and fall into the lake. And then you start pounding on his chest like an absolute maniac. If there is any permanent damage to him, I am holding you entirely legally responsible for interfering with his body." The sheer delusional projection was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. Cameron was standing on a floating dock, holding a dead cigar, smelling heavily of expensive liquor, having completely abandoned his own child to host a party full of drunken investors. Yet in his mind, the fault rested entirely on the sister he had deliberately degraded and assigned to babysitting duty without her consent. He was threatening to sue the only person who had possessed the sobriety, the vigilance, and the medical expertise to pull his child out of a watery grave. He wanted to destroy me financially because facing his own monumental failure as a father was psychologically impossible for his fragile ego. I looked my brother dead in the eye. I did not flinch away from his pointing finger. I did not apologize for his own negligence. I did not explain that I was the director of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. The absolute truth would be entirely wasted on a man who was currently drowning in his own guilt and trying desperately to drag me down into the depths with him. I turned my professional attention back to the paramedics. They were young, competent, and completely overwhelmed by the screaming, irrational parents blocking their access. One paramedic was trying to secure a pediatric oxygen mask over Leo's face, while the other was attempting to check his unstable vitals. They needed a rapid, concise medical handover to understand exactly what physiological trauma the boy had just endured under the surface of the lake. "He was submerged for an estimated 3 minutes," I stated, clearly projecting my authoritative voice over Whitney's loud, disruptive sobbing. "Pulseless and apneic upon retrieval." I performed immediate high-quality pediatric CPR. Exactly 2 minutes of continuous compressions. He achieved return of spontaneous circulation and expelled a significant volume of fluid. You need to monitor him constantly for secondary drowning and acute pulmonary edema. He needs high-flow oxygen administered immediately. The paramedic looking at me nodded sharply, instantly recognizing the precise medical terminology and the accurate clinical assessment. But Whitney whipped her head around, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "Stop talking!" she screamed at me, her voice shrill and grating. She grabbed the paramedic's arm, her diamond rings flashing harshly in the afternoon sunlight. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She works at a free public clinic giving out Band-Aids to poor people. She is completely incompetent. I want my son taken to Memorial Hospital right now. I demand that only real medical professionals touch him from this moment forward. Do you hear me? I only want real doctors treating my child." The two paramedics exchanged a quick, highly uncomfortable clinical glance. In emergency medical situations, they were legally bound to follow the directives of the parents, unless the child's life was in immediate active jeopardy. Since Leo was currently conscious, breathing independently, and coughing on the wooden dock, Whitney held the absolute legal authority to dictate his immediate care and transport. The paramedics swiftly transferred Leo onto the collapsible yellow backboard, securing the heavy straps across his small chest and legs to prevent any sudden movement. They lifted the stretcher in perfect unison, carrying him away from the dark water and up the wooden cedar stairs toward the waiting ambulance parked on the gravel driveway. Whitney and Cameron scrambled up the stairs right behind them, completely ignoring Beatrice, who was just beginning to stir groggily on the grass where she had previously fainted. The large crowd of wealthy investors parted like the Red Sea, watching the chaotic, dramatic procession with wide, horrified eyes. I followed at a steady, measured pace. My bare feet crunched painfully against the hot gravel of the long driveway as we reached the open back doors of the idling ambulance. The paramedics loaded the heavy stretcher into the brightly lit back of the rig. One of them turned around, looking anxiously between Cameron, Whitney, and me. "We only have room for one parent to ride in the back during transport," the paramedic announced, his voice tight with the intense stress of the chaotic family scene. "I am going," Whitney declared, instantly aggressively, pushing her way past her husband and stepping up into the back of the ambulance. She turned back around, glaring down at me from the elevated threshold of the emergency vehicle. Her face was a portrait of vicious, unyielding arrogance. "And keep her entirely away from us. I am explicitly denying her any permission to access my son. If she tries to follow us to the emergency room, I want her forcibly removed by hospital security. I only want the absolute best trauma doctors at Memorial Hospital handling my child today. I will not have some low-level clinic nurse interfering and causing a massive malpractice liability for my family." The paramedic looked at me, a highly apologetic expression flashing quickly across his tired face. He reached out and grabbed the heavy metal handles of the doors. I stepped back, my arms hanging loosely at my sides. I did not argue with her irrational demands. I did not plead to ride with my nephew. I simply nodded my head once, a silent, cold acknowledgement of her incredibly foolish mandate. The heavy ambulance doors slammed shut with a loud, definitive metallic thud. The powerful engine roared to life, the sirens re-engaged their piercing wail, and the massive vehicle tore down the long private driveway, leaving a thick cloud of gray dust lingering in its chaotic wake. The heavy silence that descended upon the sprawling lakeside estate was absolute and suffocating. The lavish summer party was entirely dead. The wealthy investors were standing around the patio in awkward, uncomfortable clusters, holding their rapidly warming champagne glasses, completely unsure of how to react to the horrific family drama they had just witnessed. Cameron stood near the edge of the manicured grass, frantically running his trembling hands through his hair, his chest heaving with panic and severe financial stress. Beatrice was finally sitting upright on the lawn, rubbing her forehead, asking bewildered, incoherent questions to anyone who would listen to her dramatic complaints. I stood completely alone on the hot, gravel, dark lake water, pooling around my bare feet, dripping steadily from my soaked clothes. The cold dread of the deep lake had completely vanished from my veins, instantly replaced by a sharp, focused, and utterly ruthless medical clarity. Whitney had forcefully demanded that only the absolute best trauma doctors at Memorial Hospital touch her son. She had aggressively demanded real medical professionals. She had vehemently ordered the supposed clinic nurse to stay away from her family. The sheer astronomical irony of her arrogant demands echoed in my mind, ringing with absolute crystal clarity. Memorial Hospital was exactly where they were heading right now. It was the premier trauma center in the entire region, the only medical facility truly equipped to handle a critical pediatric drowning case. And Memorial Hospital was my absolute domain. I was not just a doctor working inside that building. I was the director. I was the reigning, unquestioned authority of the entire pediatric cardiothoracic department. Every single trauma surgeon, attending physician, medical resident, and triage nurse in that hospital answered directly and unequivocally to me. I did not wait for Cameron to organize his panicked thoughts or for Beatrice to finish her dramatic attention-seeking recovery on the front lawn. I turned my back on the entire toxic spectacle of my family. I walked with calm, deliberate purpose down the long, winding service road toward the hidden maintenance shed, heading straight for my restored vintage car. I had a critical job to do. Whitney wanted the absolute best trauma surgeon at Memorial Hospital waiting for her son. I fully intended to give her exactly what she demanded. I slid into the driver's seat of my restored midnight blue classic car, the custom leather instantly absorbing the lake water still dripping from my clothes. I did not care about the upholstery. My mind was already racing miles ahead, calculating the precise physiological cascade currently ravaging my nephew's small body. I jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life with a fierce guttural growl that shook the chassis. I slammed the gear shift into drive and tore out from behind the maintenance shed tires, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and gravel. The tires squealed as I hit the main paved road, accelerating hard toward the highway that led straight into the heart of the city. My phone sitting in the center console cup holder began to vibrate violently. The screen lit up, flashing a relentless rapid-fire sequence of notifications. It was the main extended family group chat. The digital onslaught was instantaneous and entirely predictable. Beatrice was already spinning her web frantically, typing out a deeply distorted narrative to every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our contact list before the ambulance had even cleared the county line. I kept my eyes locked on the winding road ahead, pushing the accelerator closer to the floorboard, but the bold text on the glowing screen caught my peripheral vision. Beatrice sent pray for Leo. There was a terrible accident at the lake house. Vanessa was supposed to be watching the children, and she completely neglected her duties. He fell into the water while she was distracted. My jaw tightened, but my heart rate remained perfectly steady. The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering, yet completely aligned with her psychological profile. She could not process the fact that she and Cameron had nearly allowed a child to die while they drank champagne, so she immediately deflected the blame onto the easiest, most familiar target. Another message popped up instantly. Whitney sent, "She is a monster." When they finally pulled him out, she started pounding on his chest like a maniac. I tried to stop her, but she physically assaulted me. She shoved me away from my own baby. The paramedics said she probably shattered his ribs because she is just a clueless clinic nurse playing doctor. We kicked her off the property and banned her from the ambulance. Aunt Susan replied, "Oh my God, is Leo okay? How could Vanessa be so careless?" Uncle Richard chimed in. "We always knew she was irresponsible, but this is criminal. Cameron needs to press charges immediately. Do not let her anywhere near the hospital." Beatrice sent, "We are following the ambulance to Memorial Hospital now." Whitney specifically demanded only the absolute best real trauma surgeons touch him. We made sure the paramedics knew Vanessa is not a real doctor and has zero authority. Please pray the damage she caused is not permanent. The sheer volume of the toxic messages poured in a digital avalanche of misplaced blame, deliberate character assassination, and aggressive family rallying. They were constructing a fortress of lies to protect Cameron's fragile ego and Whitney's negligent mothering. They needed a villain to explain away their horrific lapse in judgment, and I was the designated scapegoat they had been utilizing for a decade. I reached over and hit the power button on the side of my phone, instantly turning the screen pitch black and plunging the car back into the steady rhythmic hum of the powerful engine. I ignored the noise completely. I felt no urge to defend myself in that group chat. I felt no desperate need to text back the truth or justify my life-saving actions. Their opinions, their lies, their entire toxic ecosystem meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I had severed the emotional cord the moment Whitney demanded I stay away from the child I had just resuscitated. They could live in their delusions for the next 45 minutes. I had a far more pressing critical mission ahead of me. The highway opened up before me, a straight dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through the fading summer evening. I pressed the gas pedal down further, the speedometer needle climbing rapidly past the legal limit. My vintage car handled the speed with aggressive grace. Somewhere on this same stretch of highway, an ambulance was racing toward the city with a critically unstable 6-year-old boy fighting a massive inflammatory response in his lungs. I needed to beat them to the hospital. I reached up to the digital display on my dashboard and tapped the Bluetooth icon. I bypassed my personal contacts and accessed the secure encrypted directory reserved strictly for top-tier hospital administration and surgical directors. I selected a specific unlisted number that bypassed the standard emergency room triage desk and connected directly to the Memorial Hospital Emergency Operations Command Center. The line rang exactly once before a sharp professional voice answered. "Memorial Emergency Communications Operator Vance speaking. State your code and emergency." "This is Dr. Vanessa Cole, Director of Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery." I stated, my voice ringing with hard, unquestionable authority over the roaring engine noise in my cabin. I am calling in a priority inbound trauma. The dispatcher's tone shifted instantaneously from standard professional to absolute rigid compliance. Yes, Dr. Cole, standing by for your directives. Go ahead. I am authorizing an immediate code Crimson I commanded using the hospital's specific designation for a massive critical pediatric trauma requiring all available specialty teams. I have a 6-year-old male patient currently in transit via county EMS. The patient suffered a cold water submersion event with an estimated downtime of 3 minutes. He was pulseless and apneic upon extraction. Copy that. Dr. Cole, the dispatcher, responded quickly, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the connection. Submersion event 3 minutes down, pulseless and apneic. I initiated high-quality cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the scene. I continued my clinical focus absolute. Compressions were maintained for exactly 2 minutes before achieving return of spontaneous circulation. The patient expelled a significant volume of fluid and exhibited spontaneous, albeit labored respiratory effort before EMS transport. However, he is at extreme, critical risk for secondary drowning, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and severe pulmonary edema. The inflammatory cascade in his lungs has already begun. Understood, Dr. Cole. What is the ETA of the transport? Approximately 20 minutes. I estimated, checking my dashboard clock and calculating the distance from the lake house to the downtown medical center. I will be arriving at the hospital in exactly 15 minutes. I am taking primary control of this patient the second those ambulance doors open. Yes, doctor. What are your immediate preparation orders? I want Trauma Bay 1 fully prepped and cleared. I barked, listing off the logistical demands with rapid-fire precision. I want a pediatric crash cart open and drawn up. Get the airway cart ready with a pediatric Macintosh blade and a size 5 uncuffed endotracheal tube. I anticipate an immediate need for rapid sequence intubation upon his arrival if his oxygen saturation drops below 85%. Trauma Bay 1 prepped, airway cart ready, Vance confirmed seamlessly. Page the on-call cardiothoracic team and the pediatric intensive care unit attending, I ordered, pushing my car even faster as the city skyline finally broke over the horizon. Tell them to drop whatever non-critical tasks they are doing and meet me in Trauma Bay 1 immediately. I also want respiratory therapy standing by with a ventilator ready to go, and page the ECMO specialist. Tell them to prime the extracorporeal membrane oxygenation circuit and bring it down to the bay. If his lungs fail to oxygenate his blood due to the fluid damage, I am putting him on bypass immediately. The dispatcher did not hesitate at the massive multi-million-dollar resource allocation I was demanding for a single patient. When the director of cardiothoracic surgery ordered an ECMO circuit, primed, the hospital moved mountains to make it happen. Paging CT surgery, PICU, attending respiratory therapy, and the ECMO specialist, now Vance confirmed. Circuit will be primed and waiting. Circuit will. One last thing, Vance. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious icy register. The parents accompanying the child are highly combative, intoxicated, and currently acting as a massive detriment to his medical care. They explicitly demanded the absolute best trauma surgeons in the hospital treat their son. Understood, Dr. Cole. Do you require security presence in the bay? I want a full security detail posted directly outside the sliding glass doors of Trauma Bay 1, I commanded. The parents are to be contained in the main waiting room. Under absolutely no circumstances are they to be allowed past the triage doors or into the treatment area. They will interfere with the intubation process. Keep them out. Security detail assigned to Trauma Bay 1. Vance confirmed. We are ready for you, Dr. Cole. I ended the call, the Bluetooth disconnecting with a soft chime. The cabin of my car fell quiet again, save for the powerful hum of the engine and the rushing wind outside. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Whitney had screamed that she only wanted real medical professionals handling her child. She had aggressively demanded that the lowly clinic nurse stay far away from her precious family. Cameron had threatened to sue me for touching his son, blaming me for his own catastrophic negligence. Beatrice was currently treating the family group chat like a public relations spin room, assassinating my character to protect her golden child's image. They believed they held all the power. They believed their wealth, their status, and their loud, aggressive demands could bend the world to their will. They believed they could discard me, humiliate me, and banish me to the shadows while they demanded VIP treatment from the hospital staff. They had absolutely no idea what they were driving into. I navigated the final sharp curve of the highway, the massive towering glass structure of Memorial Hospital, coming into full view against the darkening evening sky. The glowing red emergency sign illuminated the sky like a beacon. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable sister who sat at the children's table and accepted their baseless insults. I was stepping into my kingdom, into a world where my authority was absolute and unquestionable. I pulled my vintage car into the reserved gated parking lot marked specifically for chief medical directors, swiped my security badge, and parked in my designated spot. I stepped out of the car, my clothes still damp from the lake, and walked toward the emergency room entrance. The trap was perfectly set, the medical team was fully primed, and my family was walking blindly right into the center of my domain. The automatic sliding doors of Memorial Hospital parted with a soft mechanical hiss, welcoming me into the harsh, hyper-illuminated world of the emergency department. The air conditioning hit my damp clothes, sending a sharp, immediate chill across my skin, but I barely registered the temperature drop. The familiar sterile scent of antiseptic, freshly laundered linens, and the faint metallic tang of blood immediately grounded me. This was my sanctuary. This was the fortress where I held absolute command. While the outside world operated on the unpredictable whims of human foolishness and arrogant mistakes, this building operated on pure science, rigorous protocol, and undeniable facts. I stepped onto the polished linoleum floor, my bare feet having been shoved into a pair of spare surgical clogs I kept in the trunk of my vintage car. Every muscle in my back and shoulders ached with a dull, throbbing intensity from performing aggressive cardiopulmonary resuscitation on the wooden dock just 30 minutes prior. My lungs still burned slightly from the dark lake water, and my hair hung in tangled, damp strands around my face. I looked like a disaster to the untrained eye. I looked like a woman who had been dragged through the mud and left for dead. But my posture was entirely rigid, my spine straight as a steel rod. I did not walk like a victim or a disgraced relative. I walked with the measured, predatory stride of an apex predator returning to her own territory. The main waiting room was a vast open space designed to accommodate dozens of panicked families on any given night. But tonight it felt entirely suffocated by the chaotic, overwhelming presence of my relatives. I paused behind a thick concrete pillar near the entrance, allowing myself a few seconds to clinically observe the absolute circus unfolding directly in front of the main triage desk. Whitney was currently slamming her open palms repeatedly against the reinforced glass of the reception counter. Her designer silk cover-up was stained with lake water and mud, her expensive sunglasses pushed askew on top of her head. She was shrieking at a volume that made the nearby patients waiting for minor treatments visibly cringe and turn away. "Do you have any idea who my husband is?" Whitney screamed, pointing an aggressive manicured finger at the stoic triage nurse stationed behind the glass. "We do not wait in public lobbies with common people. My son is a VIP patient. I want him transferred to a private luxury pediatric suite immediately. I demand to speak to the hospital administrator right this second, or I will personally ensure that every single one of you is fired by tomorrow morning." Cameron was standing right beside her, his face flushed a dangerous mottled purple that suggested his blood pressure was currently reaching hypertensive crisis levels. He had completely abandoned any pretense of being a composed, wealthy finance mogul. He was acting like a cornered, panicked animal, desperately trying to throw his imaginary wealth at a medical wall that simply did not care about his bank account. "I will write a check right now," Cameron bellowed, pulling a leather wallet from his soaked linen pants and waving a platinum credit card at the glass. "Name your price. I want the chief of surgery down here immediately. I want a private security detail for my family." We are dealing with a massive legal liability regarding the woman who assaulted my son on our property, and I will not have my family subjected to this standard pathetic level of public care. You people are treating us like we are nobodies. The triage nurse, a 20-year veteran named Brenda, who I knew personally and respected deeply, did not even blink. She typed calmly on her keyboard, her face a mask of absolute, impenetrable professionalism. She had dealt with gang members, violent narcotics addicts, and psychotic breakdowns. A screaming over leveraged finance bro and his hysterical wife barely registered on her stress scale. Sir, your son is currently in Trauma Bay 1 receiving critical life-saving evaluations from our emergency response team, Brenda stated clearly, her voice cutting through his loud ranting with effortless authority. Hospital protocol strictly prohibits family members from entering the active trauma bays during the initial stabilization phase. Your financial status does not override our medical protocols. You will be seated in the waiting area until the attending physician is ready to update you. If you continue to threaten my staff, I will have hospital security escort you entirely off the premises. Beatrice, who had been hovering slightly behind Cameron, suddenly pushed her way to the front of the desk. She had managed to compose herself slightly since fainting on the lawn, but her arrogance had completely returned, fully fueled by her desperate need to control the narrative of this disastrous afternoon. "Listen to me, you insolent woman," Beatrice hissed, leaning close to the glass and using her most condescending, elitist tone. "We are dealing with a highly sensitive family emergency. The woman who caused this accident, the babysitter we hired for the afternoon, is completely unhinged. She is a low-level clinic worker who thinks she knows medicine, and she forcefully interfered with my grandson's care. We need absolute assurance that she will not be allowed past the front doors of this hospital. We are restricting all access." I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar. I did not try to sneak past them. I did not lower my head or attempt to avoid their line of sight. I walked directly toward the center of the waiting room, my footsteps clicking softly against the polished floor. Beatrice caught the movement in her peripheral vision. Her head snapped around, her eyes widening in immediate furious recognition as she spotted me walking calmly across the room. Her entire body tensed, her posture shifting from a demanding socialite to an aggressive territorial gatekeeper. She immediately broke away from the triage desk, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the linoleum as she marched directly across the room to intercept me. She planted herself squarely in my path, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, effectively creating a physical blockade between me and the hallway leading to the secure medical bays. "What exactly do you think you are doing here?" Beatrice demanded, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper, designed to intimidate me without alerting the nearby security guards. I stopped precisely 2 feet in front of her. I did not shrink back. I looked down at her, maintaining perfect, unwavering eye contact. "I am going to work, Beatrice. Move out of my way." Her face twisted with a mixture of absolute disgust and mocking disbelief. She let out a short, cruel scoff. "You are going to work. Are you completely delusional, Vanessa? We explicitly told you to stay away from Leo. You have caused enough trauma and destruction for one single day. You failed at your one simple job of watching the children. You let my grandson fall into a lake, and then you physically assaulted his mother. You are a complete liability." Cameron and Whitney, realizing that Beatrice had intercepted me, abandoned their assault on the triage desk and hurried over to join the blockade. Cameron stepped up beside our mother, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of physical intimidation. "I told you I was going to sue you, Vanessa." Cameron growled, his voice shaking with poorly concealed panic. "You have absolutely no right to be in this building. I am the father, and I am formally banning you from having any contact with my child. You are not family. You are a dangerous, incompetent clinic worker who nearly killed my son to play hero." Whitney nodded vigorously, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "Get out of here right now. I am calling the police if you do not turn around and walk out those doors." Beatrice leaned in closer to me, her eyes narrowing into cold, hateful slits. She delivered her final venomous verdict, her lips curled into a sneer of ultimate disrespect. "Go find another waiting room, Vanessa. Better yet, go back to your pathetic little clinic. This space is for family, not the babysitter. You have done enough damage today. Do not embarrass yourself any further by pretending you belong here." I stood there in the center of the hostile triangle they had formed around me. I did not defend my actions on the dock. I did not explain that I had single-handedly reversed a fatal hypoxic arrest while they screamed and cried. I simply stared at them, absorbing the absolute concentrated toxicity of their delusion. They were so deeply trapped in their own false narrative, so incredibly desperate to make me the villain of their story, that they were completely blind to the reality of the environment they were currently standing in. Suddenly, the heavy reinforced double doors leading to the restricted trauma wing burst open with a violent, resounding crash. The loud noise echoed sharply through the quiet waiting room, instantly silencing my family's aggressive ranting. We all turned our heads simultaneously to look toward the restricted hallway. Striding through the open doors was Dr. Thomas Arrington, the formidable chief of emergency medicine at Memorial Hospital. Thomas was a towering, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with stark silver hair, piercing gray eyes, and a reputation for being an absolutely ruthless, no-nonsense veteran of trauma medicine. He was wearing dark blue surgical scrubs, a stethoscope draped haphazardly around his neck, and he was clutching a digital tablet in his hand. His face was tense, his brow furrowed in deep, anxious concentration as his eyes frantically scanned the crowded waiting room. Cameron, instantly recognizing the authoritative demeanor and the distinguished appearance of a senior hospital official, saw his golden opportunity to assert his dominance. He immediately broke away from the circle surrounding me and stepped aggressively directly into Thomas's path, throwing his shoulders back and raising his voice to command attention. "Are you the man in charge here?" Cameron demanded loudly, waving his platinum credit card in the air like a VIP pass. "I am Cameron Cole. My son was just brought in here and I have been waiting for 10 minutes without a single proper update. I demand that you move him to a private wing immediately, and I want an entire security team stationed outside his door. We are dealing with a highly sensitive legal matter regarding this woman standing right here." Thomas did not even break his stride. He did not slow down. He did not acknowledge the platinum card, and he certainly did not care about Cameron's demands. With a swift, dismissive motion, Thomas literally brushed past my brother as if Cameron were nothing more than a minor, irritating gust of wind. He sidestepped the aggressive finance bro entirely, leaving Cameron standing there with his mouth hanging open, speaking his arrogant demands to empty air. Thomas's frantic gaze swept across the waiting area until it locked onto me standing behind Beatrice. The moment he saw me, the intense, anxious tension completely vanished from his broad shoulders. The heavy lines of stress on his face immediately smoothed out, replaced by a look of profound, overwhelming relief. He let out a loud, audible exhale, his entire demeanor shifting from panicked urgency to absolute respectful compliance. He walked briskly past Beatrice and Whitney, ignoring them completely, and stopped directly in front of me. Dr. Cole Thomas projected his voice clearly, his tone ringing with deep, unmistakable professional reverence. "Thank God you are here." The air in the waiting room seemed to instantly evaporate. The profound silence that suddenly enveloped my family was so absolute, so incredibly heavy, it felt like a physical weight dropping from the ceiling. Over at the triage desk, Nurse Brenda and her colleagues instantly stood up straighter, their posture snapping to attention the moment they heard my name spoken by the chief of medicine. "We received your Code Crimson directive en route." Thomas continued, rapidly delivering a precise medical briefing directly to me, completely ignoring the 3 stunned statues standing inches away. "The patient arrived via County EMS 2 minutes ago. He is currently maintaining spontaneous respirations, but his oxygen saturation is dipping dangerously low. The inflammatory cascade is highly aggressive, exactly as you predicted from the submersion timeline. We prepped Trauma Bay 1 exactly as you ordered. The cardiothoracic surgical team is fully scrubbed and standing by. Respiratory therapy has the ventilator prepped, and the ECMO circuit is primed, verified, and rolling into the bay right now. We are fully ready for your command." I nodded sharply, my mind instantly shifting gears from the petty family drama to the critical medical crisis waiting for me behind those doors. "Thank you, Thomas. Have anesthesia prep for a rapid sequence intubation. I want to secure his airway before his lungs fill entirely with fluid. I will be in the bay in 60 seconds." Beatrice, who had been standing frozen like a mannequin, suddenly seemed to snap out of her paralyzed state. Her brain, completely poisoned by a decade of looking down on me, simply could not process the reality unfolding in front of her. She could not accept the fact that the powerful chief of medicine was deferring to the daughter she had just ordered to go find another waiting room. She stepped forward, letting out a loud, harsh, incredibly arrogant scoff that grated against the quiet tension of the room. Dr. Beatrice laughed, waving her hand dismissively between Thomas and me. "You must be deeply confused, sir. You have made a terrible mistake. She is not a doctor. She is just Leo's babysitter. She works at some dirty little clinic downtown handing out flyers. She has absolutely no business being involved in my grandson's medical care." Thomas stopped dead. He slowly turned his head away from me and looked at my mother. The expression that settled onto his face was a portrait of absolute withering, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Beatrice as if she were a toxic, contaminating substance that had somehow sneaked into his sterile hospital. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply lowered his tone to a cold, razor-sharp register that cut through her arrogance like a surgical scalpel. Babysitter Thomas repeated the words slowly, his voice dripping with pure, unmistakable contempt. He stepped slightly closer to Beatrice, towering over her. "Ma'am, you are standing in the presence of Dr. Vanessa Cole. She is our director of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. She is the top trauma surgeon on the entire East Coast. She holds patents that have saved thousands of lives, and she runs the most elite surgical department in this state." Thomas paused, letting the crushing weight of his words settle over them, before delivering the final devastating blow. "The only reason your grandson has a heartbeat right now is because Dr. Cole performed a flawless, miraculous field resuscitation. If you speak to my director with that level of profound disrespect ever again, I will personally have security throw you out of my hospital and ban you from the premises permanently. Do you understand me?" The family froze. They were trapped in a state of stunned, humiliating silence. Cameron's jaw physically dropped open, his eyes darting frantically between my plain clothes and Thomas's furious expression. The realization of his catastrophic misjudgment hit him like a freight train. Whitney covered her mouth with both hands, her face draining of all color as she realized she had physically assaulted the most powerful surgeon in the building. Beatrice stood completely immobilized, her carefully constructed narrative of superiority shattering into a million irreparable pieces on the linoleum floor. They had spent 10 years mocking me. They had spent the entire afternoon trying to destroy me. And in 30 seconds, a single man had completely obliterated their delusions, exposing them as the foolish, arrogant frauds they truly were. I did not gloat. I did not offer a single word of explanation or validation to the three people standing frozen in their own agonizing humiliation. I simply gave my mother one final chilling look of utter pity. Then I turned my back on them, forever pushed through the heavy double doors and walked into the trauma bay to save my nephew's life. The heavy double doors sealed shut behind me with a definitive pneumatic hiss. That sharp sound instantly severed me from the pathetic family drama unfolding out in the public waiting room. I did not look back. The moment my bare feet crossed the threshold into the sterile, hyper-illuminated corridor of the critical care wing, the personal betrayal evaporated from my mind entirely. It was replaced by a cold, calculated, and absolute clinical focus. I moved rapidly toward the stainless steel scrub sinks located just outside Trauma Bay 1. The rhythmic sound of the spare surgical clogs I had slipped into slapped against the polished linoleum, matching the accelerated adrenaline-fueled tempo of my own heartbeat. Through the massive glass observation windows of the trauma bay, I could clearly see the organized chaos of my highly trained medical team surrounding the small stretcher. Respiratory therapists, veteran trauma nurses, and chief surgical residents moved in a synchronized, urgent dance around the critical patient. I thrust my hands directly under the motion sensor faucet, letting the scalding hot water and harsh chemical chlorhexidine soap strip away the last lingering remnants of the dark lake water. I scrubbed my forearms with brutal, methodical efficiency, my eyes never leaving the flashing monitors visible through the glass. A veteran scrub nurse materialized silently beside me, holding open a sterile blue surgical gown. I thrust my arms into the sleeves turned sharply to let her tie the back securely and snapped a pair of tight latex surgical gloves over my hands. I pushed my way through the glass doors of the trauma bay, and the ambient noise of the room instantly shifted around me. The panicked shouts and frantic energy that usually accompanied a pediatric code were completely absent in my department. My team operated with disciplined precision, but the underlying tension in the air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. "Give me a full status report right now," I demanded, stepping directly to the head of the bed to physically evaluate my patient. The senior pediatric intensive care attending looked up from the glowing digital monitor, his face grim and pale under his surgical mask. "Dr. Cole, the patient was successfully intubated upon arrival using a size 5 cuffed endotracheal tube," Evans stated, rapidly delivering the critical data. "However, his oxygen saturation is plummeting at an alarming rate. We started him immediately on 100% fraction of inspired oxygen, but he is currently hovering at a critical 78% and steadily dropping. He has entered severe acute respiratory distress syndrome. The inflammatory response from the lake water submersion is catastrophically aggressive." I leaned over the stainless steel bed, shining a bright penlight into Leo's dilated pupils, before swiftly moving my stethoscope across his small, fragile chest. The terrifying sound I heard through the earpieces confirmed my absolute worst clinical fears. Instead of the clear, rhythmic exchange of air, his lungs sounded like crumpled paper mixing with thick, bubbling fluid. The dirty algae-filled lake water he had aspirated during his submersion had violently stripped away the vital surfactant lining his delicate alveoli. His young body was reacting to the foreign contaminants with a massive, uncontrolled inflammatory cascade. Toxic fluid was rapidly leaking into his lungs, effectively drowning the boy from the inside out, while he lay perfectly still on the table. This was secondary drowning in its most lethal, accelerated, and unforgiving form. "He is third spacing fluid directly into his pulmonary tissue," I stated loudly. My eyes locked on the declining red numbers flashing ominously on the overhead monitor. "Conventional mechanical ventilation is completely failing us. The positive end expiratory pressure from the machine is simply not enough to keep his flooded alveoli open. We are losing him to profound, irreversible hypoxia." The alarms on the primary ventilator began to shriek a high-pitched, urgent warning that his vital organs were starving for oxygen. His heart rate, which had been artificially stabilized by emergency medication during transport, began to display dangerous, erratic arrhythmias on the EKG readout. The standard medical interventions had reached the absolute limit of their efficacy. We had less than 10 minutes before his brain suffered permanent, irreversible anoxic damage. "There is only one viable option left to save his cerebral cortex and preserve his vital organ function," I announced to the room, projecting my voice over the screaming alarms. "We need to bypass his damaged lungs entirely. Prep him for immediate venoarterial extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. I am cannulating his neck vessels right now," the ECMO specialist, a highly trained clinical perfusionist, immediately rolled the massive, complex life support machine closer to the sterile surgical field. The equipment was fully primed with compatible donor blood, heated to exact body temperature, and ready for instant deployment. It was an astonishingly sophisticated piece of medical technology, essentially acting as an artificial heart and lung system. It would pull the deoxygenated blood out of Leo's failing body, infuse it with life-saving oxygen, remove the toxic carbon dioxide, and pump it directly back into his arterial system. It was the absolute pinnacle of modern trauma surgery, reserved only for desperate cases, and it came with an astronomical daily price tag. I reached out my gloved right hand, fully expecting the scrub technician to slap a number 11 scalpel firmly into my palm so I could make the initial life-saving incisions into my nephew's neck. Instead, the heavy glass doors of the trauma bay slid open with a jarring sound, breaking the sterile concentration of the room. Harold Vance, the senior vice president of hospital administration, walked into the chaotic trauma bay, wearing a tailored gray suit and carrying a deeply apologetic yet firm expression. "Dr. Cole, I need you to halt the ECMO deployment immediately. Harold stated loudly, his voice tight with administrative anxiety and legal caution. I did not lower my outstretched hand. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the sterile surgical field covering Leo's neck, my entire body rigid with absolute, unadulterated fury. Harold, I have a 6-year-old pediatric patient actively dying from acute respiratory failure on this table. I growled, my tone dropping to a dangerous icy register. If I do not cannulate his carotid artery and his jugular vein in the next 5 minutes, he will go into full cardiac arrest and he will die. Get out of my trauma bay right now. Harold stepped closer, completely ignoring my hostile command. He held up a digital tablet displaying a dense color-coded spreadsheet of billing information and insurance demographics. Vanessa. I am so incredibly sorry, but my hands are legally tied by the hospital's strict financial protocols regarding experimental and extreme life support measures. We ran the patient's demographics through the intake system while you were busy scrubbing in outside. The comprehensive insurance information currently on file for Cameron Cole is completely invalid. The premium payments on his executive policy lapsed over 3 full months ago, and the policy has been officially canceled by the provider due to severe non-payment. The patient lying on your table is entirely uninsured. The words hung in the air, crashing against the sterile walls of the trauma bay like a physical blow. My team froze, their eyes darting between me, the dying child, and the hospital administrator standing by the door. I slowly lowered my hand, turning my head to glare at Harold through my protective surgical loops. Are you seriously telling me that you are denying critical life-saving medical equipment to a suffocating child because his father forgot to pay a bill? I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. You know exactly how the board operates regarding these specific resources. Harold defended himself, looking genuinely pained but resolute. ECMO is not standard emergency care. It is a highly specialized, incredibly expensive, limited resource that costs upwards of $10,000 a day just to maintain, not including the surgical installation fees, the perfusionist's salary, and the specialized ICU bed. Hospital policy dictates we cannot deploy the machine for a non-insured patient without immediate financial clearance or a massive cash deposit. I stared at him, the reality of the situation rapidly clicking into place inside my analytical mind. Cameron, the arrogant golden child who had mocked my clinic car. Cameron, the finance mogul who lived in a massive estate and bragged about luxury yacht rentals. Cameron, the man who had threatened to sue me just an hour ago for touching his son, was completely broke. His entire life was a pathetic, meticulously constructed financial fraud. He was drowning in secret debt, projecting an illusion of immense wealth, while failing to provide basic health insurance for his own child. His desperate need to maintain his fake social status had now placed a massive bureaucratic death sentence directly over his son's head. Leo's oxygen saturation monitor let out another piercing, sustained shriek, dropping to a terrifying 68%. His lips were turning a dark, bruised purple beneath the clear plastic of his endotracheal tube. We do not have time for this administrative nonsense, Harold, I shouted, pointing a gloved finger directly at the crashing monitor. He is coding. The machine is already primed and in the room. I am the director of this department, and I am ordering the deployment of this circuit based on medical necessity. I cannot authorize it. Dr. Cole Harold insisted, holding his ground, despite the sheer terror unfolding on the table beside us. The electronic lock on the ECMO circuit requires an administrative override code for uninsured patients. If I enter that code without securing the proper financial guarantee from the family, the hospital board will terminate both of us for gross misuse of corporate assets. I need to speak to the parents immediately to secure a massive deposit. If they cannot produce the funds instantly, I have to order the perfusionist to stand down. The sheer, absolute absurdity of the bureaucratic wall separating my dying nephew from the machine that could save his life made my blood boil. I looked down at Leo's chest, watching it struggle against the ventilator, pumping oxygen into his fluid-filled lungs. He was fighting so hard, entirely unaware that his father's fragile, pathetic ego and desperate financial lies were the true obstacles threatening to end his life. "Go get them," I ordered, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm that made Harold flinch. "Go out to that waiting room, Harold. Bring Cameron and Whitney Cole to the administrative consultation room right now. Tell them exactly how much money it costs to turn on this machine. And when their credit cards inevitably decline, you tell them exactly who holds the power to sign the waiver that can save their son." Harold nodded tightly, understanding the grave severity of the situation. He turned on his heel and rushed out of the trauma bay, the glass doors sliding shut behind him. I turned back to the surgical table, placing my hands gently on either side of Leo's small head. "Hold on, buddy," I whispered softly under my surgical mask, watching the monitor. "Just hold on a few more minutes." The ultimate reckoning was finally here. My brother's fraudulent existence was about to be brutally exposed in the most humiliating way possible. Harold Vance marched down the brightly lit corridor of the emergency department, his leather shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. He was accustomed to delivering bad news daily, but this situation was unique. He was walking out to confront a family that had spent the past hour terrorizing his triage staff, demanding special treatment based on a financial status that his digital tablet proved was entirely fabricated. Harold pushed through the heavy double doors into the main waiting room. Cameron was pacing aggressively near the reception desk, his face flushed red with indignation. Whitney sat on a plastic chair, crying loudly into a designer tissue. Beatrice stood nearby, arms crossed tightly, radiating a toxic aura of wounded pride and furious entitlement. They looked up instantly as Harold approached. "Are you the hospital administrator?" Cameron demanded, stepping forward to block Harold's path. "It is about time. I demand to know why that clinic nurse is still in the building. My son requires the best care available, and I will not have my family subjected to this public waiting area a second longer." Harold did not flinch. He maintained a perfectly neutral expression. "Mr. Cole, I am Harold Vance, Senior Vice President of Hospital Administration. I need you, your wife, and your mother to step into private consultation room B immediately. We have a highly critical situation regarding your son's medical care and the financial authorization required to proceed." Cameron puffed out his chest, misinterpreting Harold's serious tone as deference. "Finally, some competent service," Cameron sneered, grabbing Whitney by the arm. "Let us go. I will write whatever check you need to get my son away from these people." Beatrice followed closely, wearing a smug expression. They marched into the small, windowless room, oblivious to the catastrophic reality check waiting for them. Harold closed the heavy wooden door behind them, instantly cutting off the ambient noise. The silence in the small space was absolute. He did not invite them to sit. He looked down at his digital tablet. "Mr. Cole, your son Leo has suffered secondary drowning. His lungs are failing rapidly. He requires immediate deployment of an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation circuit to survive. It is an extremely invasive, highly specialized life support machine that bypasses his damaged lungs entirely." Whitney gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in terror. Cameron simply waved his platinum credit card impatiently in the air. "Then turn the machine on," Cameron ordered loudly. "I do not care what it costs. Do whatever it takes to save him." Harold did not reach for the card. He looked Cameron dead in the eye. "I cannot do that, sir. This hospital requires either verified, active premium health insurance or a massive upfront cash deposit to authorize the deployment of the ECMO circuit for uninsured patients." Cameron laughed, a harsh, arrogant sound that echoed loudly in the confined space. "We have top-tier premium executive insurance. Run my name through your system again. You people are incredibly incompetent. I am absolutely insured. No, Mr. Cole. You are not." Harold stated, his voice dropping to a flat, undeniable register. "We ran your demographics directly through the National Provider Database 3 times. Your executive health insurance policy lapsed exactly 3 months ago due to severe non-payment." The policy has been officially canceled by the provider. You and your entire family are completely uninsured. Whitney whipped her head around to stare at Cameron, her eyes wide with total shock. Cameron, what is he talking about? Why would our insurance be canceled? We just rented a luxury yacht last week. Cameron's face suddenly drained of all color. The arrogant red of his cheeks turned to a sickly shade of ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. The invincible facade of the Golden Child was cracking right down the middle. Look, there must be a clerical error. Cameron finally stammered, his voice losing all of its loud bravado. I am moving massive funds around right now. I have huge capital tied up in commercial real estate developments. The insurance company made a mistake. Harold shook his head slowly. There is no mistake, sir. The machine costs tens of thousands of dollars a day to operate. I need an immediate verified deposit of $250,000 right now, or I have to order the surgical team to stand down. Your son is running out of time. Cameron's hands began to shake violently. The absolute reality of his secret catastrophic financial ruin was colliding directly with his son's mortality. He shoved his platinum credit card across the table toward Harold. Run it! Cameron demanded, his voice cracking with pure panic. Run it for the full amount right now. Harold pulled a mobile card reader from his pocket. He swiped the heavy metal card. A sharp, negative beep filled the quiet room. Declined, Harold stated clinically. Cameron yanked out his wallet, his fingers fumbling desperately as he pulled out a gold corporate card. Try this one. It is tied directly to my business accounts. Harold swiped the gold card. Another negative beep. Declined. Harold repeated, his eyes fixed on Cameron. Cameron threw 3 more credit cards onto the table, his breathing turning into rapid gasps. Run all of them. Split the payment. Just run the cards. Harold swiped every single piece of plastic. Each attempt was met with the exact same harsh, undeniable electronic rejection. Every single account was completely maxed out, frozen, or flagged for insufficient funds. The wealthy finance mogul was entirely broke. Whitney backed away from Cameron until her shoulders hit the wall. She stared at the pile of useless plastic on the table, the horrible truth finally penetrating her vanity and obsession with status. You are broke, Whitney whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror and betrayal. You lied to me. You lied to everyone. We have nothing. Cameron could not even look at her. He stared at the floor, his entire body trembling. Beatrice refused to accept defeat. The matriarch stepped forward, pulling a sleek black leather wallet from her designer handbag. She looked at Cameron with profound disappointment before turning her haughty gaze back to the hospital administrator. My son has clearly made some foolish temporary miscalculations with his business liquidity, Beatrice announced, trying desperately to salvage the family's shattered dignity. But I will not allow my grandson to suffer because of it. I am the primary account holder for the Cole family estate. Run my card for the entire deposit right now. I will handle Cameron's financial mess later. Harold accepted the sleek black card from Beatrice. He swiped it through the reader. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before letting out the exact same sharp negative beep. Declined, Harold stated. Beatrice froze. Her hand, still extended in the air, began to tremble. That is absolutely impossible, she snapped, her voice rising in panic. I have millions in my primary investment accounts. There is absolutely no way that card is declined. Run it again. Your machine is broken. Harold did not swipe the card again. He placed it gently on the table next to Cameron's useless pile of plastic. Ma'am, the terminal indicates a major financial institution has placed a hard freeze on your primary accounts. This happens when personal assets are heavily leveraged as collateral against failing commercial loans. Harold looked directly at Cameron, who shrank back against the wall. Beatrice slowly turned to look at her golden child. The devastating realization hit her like a physical blow. Cameron had not just bankrupted himself. In his reckless attempts to save his failing real estate business and maintain his lavish lifestyle, he had secretly leveraged his mother's accounts. He had drained her estate entirely. He had taken everything. "You stole from me," Beatrice whispered, her voice cracking as her son's betrayal crushed her lungs. "You took my money to pay for your yachts and fancy parties. You left us with nothing." Cameron buried his face in his hands, sobbing now. "I thought I could turn it around," he cried. "I just needed one big investment to clear. I was going to put it all back, I promise." Whitney sank to the floor, weeping hysterically, as her entire world evaporated into thin air. The room descended into a chaotic symphony of crying and absolute despair. They were completely stripped of their power and wealth. Harold cleared his throat loudly, forcing their attention back to the grim present. "This family dispute does not change the critical medical situation occurring right now in Trauma Bay 1, Harold stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. "I need $250,000 right now, or I must order the perfusionist to turn off the machine. If that happens, your son will not survive the hour." Harold Vance maintained his rigid, uncompromising posture, his face devoid of any administrative sympathy. "The hospital takes a solemn oath to provide stabilizing emergency care, Mr. Cole. We have done exactly that. We retrieved your son's pulse and established a secure airway. However, ECMO is not standard stabilization. It is a highly finite, astronomically expensive medical resource. I cannot legally deploy it without secure financial collateral. There is only one single administrative loophole in our entire corporate protocol that can bypass this strict financial blockade." Whitney's head snapped up from her hands. Her mascara smeared across her cheeks in dark, jagged lines, making her look like a tragic, ruined porcelain doll. "What is it?" she pleaded, her voice hoarse and desperate, stripped of all its former haughty arrogance. "Tell us. We will do whatever it takes. We will sign whatever you need." "The hospital bylaws allow for a specialized medical and financial liability waiver," Harold explained, methodically staring them down. "The chief attending surgeon overseeing the case can choose to personally sign a legal document absorbing the absolute entirety of the medical and financial risk. By signing this specific waiver, the surgeon personally guarantees the hospital will be paid in full out of their own pocket. This means if the patient defaults, the surgeon owes the hospital millions of dollars from their own private assets. It is a provision designed for extreme, unprecedented circumstances, and it is almost never utilized because no sane medical professional would ever risk their personal fortune, their pristine credit, and their medical license for a patient who has no means of repayment." Cameron seized on this tiny sliver of hope like a drowning man grabbing a heavy lifeline. "Bring him to me," Cameron demanded, a brief, pathetic flash of his old, entitled arrogance returning to his flushed face. "Bring this chief surgeon here right now. I will sign a promissory note directly to him. I will owe him the money. Just get him in this room so we can make a deal man to man." Harold looked at Cameron with an expression of profound pity mixed with intense, unmistakable disdain. "The chief attending surgeon is not a him, Mr. Cole. And she is certainly not coming to this small room to negotiate with a bankrupt man. If you want her to risk her entire personal fortune and her brilliant medical career to save your dying son, you are going to have to walk up to her executive office and ask her yourself." Beatrice, still reeling from the devastating revelation that her golden son had secretly drained her entire estate, narrowed her eyes. A sickening, horrifying realization began to dawn on her perfectly contoured, pale face. "Who is the chief attending surgeon?" Beatrice whispered the words, scraping against her dry throat like sandpaper, her heart dreading the inevitable answer. Harold turned and opened the heavy wooden door, gesturing out into the brightly lit corridor of the executive medical wing. "Dr. Vanessa Cole is waiting for you in her office at the very end of the hall. I suggest you walk quickly. Your grandson is entirely out of time." The silence that fell over the three of them was absolute, suffocating, and brutally heavy. The psychological destruction was utterly complete. They had spent the entire afternoon degrading me, treating me like an incompetent lower-class citizen, insulting my career, and physically assaulting me on a wooden dock. Now stripped of their fake wealth, their fancy luxury cars, and their arrogant pride. They had to walk the entire length of the hospital and beg that exact same woman for a multi-million-dollar miracle. Cameron's legs barely supported his weight as he stumbled out of the consultation room. Whitney followed, weeping openly and uncontrollably, her designer clothes looking ridiculous and tragic against the harsh, unforgiving hospital lighting. Beatrice walked rigidly behind them, her entire worldview and social hierarchy completely shattered into irreparable pieces. The long walk down the executive corridor felt like a slow, agonizing march to the gallows. Every single step Cameron took felt like walking on broken glass. As they passed open doors and administrative desks, the hospital staff stopped typing and simply watched them, their eyes filled with knowing disdain. The Whisper Network had already circulated the news of their disgraceful behavior at the triage desk. The arrogant, wealthy family who had screamed at the nurses were now marching toward the office of the very woman they had demanded be thrown off the premises. At the very end of the hall stood a set of massive frosted glass double doors. Etched into the heavy glass in bold silver lettering were the words, Director of Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery, Dr. Vanessa Cole. Cameron reached out with a trembling, sweat-slicked hand and pushed the heavy glass doors open. They stepped into a vast, breathtakingly impressive executive corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning panoramic view of the darkening city skyline. The heavy oak bookshelves were lined with thick medical tomes and bound journals featuring my own published research. A secure glass display case held 3 distinct surgical instruments I had personally designed and patented. The expansive Persian rug beneath my desk was hand-woven and flawless. The air smelled of expensive cedar wood and sterile perfection. It was a monument to monumental, undeniable self-made success. Sitting behind the massive, polished mahogany desk was me. I was still wearing my dark blue surgical scrubs, but a fresh, pristine white lab coat was draped impeccably over my shoulders. My hands rested calmly on the leather desk pad, my fingers steepled together in silent authority. I did not stand when they entered the room. I did not offer a comforting smile or a word of greeting. I looked at them with the cold, calculated detachment of a judge preparing to deliver a final, unyielding sentence. Vanessa Cameron choked out, stepping hesitantly toward the massive desk like a terrified child. He looked around the immaculate office, the reality of my immense power and vast wealth finally crushing the very last remnants of his delusion. Vanessa, please. The administrator said you can sign a waiver. He said you have the authority to authorize the machine and save him. I did not speak. I let the heavy, agonizing silence stretch out, forcing them to stand there and endure the unbearable, crushing weight of their own intense humiliation. I watched Cameron's bloodshot eyes dart to my framed diplomas from Johns Hopkins, the very medical school dreams he had viciously mocked me for abandoning just hours ago. I watched Beatrice stare at the expensive original modern art hanging on my walls, her mind struggling violently to reconcile this display of vast, self-made wealth with the pathetic, struggling daughter narrative she had maliciously clung to for a decade. "Vanessa, I am begging you," Whitney cried out, her voice breaking completely into a guttural sob. The haughty, arrogant woman who had demanded only real doctors touch her child was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, desperate mother. Whitney lunged forward and physically dropped to her knees right in front of my mahogany desk. Her knees hit the Persian rug so hard it must have bruised the bone, but she did not care. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, sobbing so violently that her breath hitched in ragged, desperate gasps. "Please, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for what I said on the dock. I am sorry I shoved you. I was a monster. You are a genius, you are a lifesaver, and I am absolutely nothing. Please do not let my baby die because his parents are terrible, worthless people. Please save him. I will be your servant. I will do anything you ask for the rest of my life." Cameron, seeing his wife prostrate on the floor, crumbled completely. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto his knees right beside Whitney. The golden child, the arrogant finance brother who had demanded I hide my vintage car so he could impress his fake friends, was kneeling on my office carpet, weeping openly and pathetically. "I have nothing," Cameron sobbed, his tears dropping onto his ruined linen pants. "I lost everything, Vanessa. The business is a complete sham. I have been moving shell money around for 2 years. Mom's money is completely wiped out. I am facing a federal indictment for severe financial fraud. I am a complete and utter failure. I am the absolute embarrassment of this entire family. But Leo is innocent. Please, I know I do not deserve your help. I know I have been a toxic, disgusting monster to you, but please sign the paper." My gaze shifted slowly, methodically from the weeping couple on the floor to the woman standing stiffly behind them. Beatrice had not yet fallen to her knees. She was trembling violently, her face a mask of profound agony and entirely shattered pride. She was watching her golden, perfect son, the man she had worshipped and funded and praised to the high heavens, grovel on the floor in front of the daughter she had deemed a pathetic, useless embarrassment. All her country club friends, all her high society status, all her arrogant pride had been incinerated in the span of 30 minutes. "And what about you, Mother?" I asked, my voice slicing through the sound of Cameron and Whitney's weeping like a freshly sharpened surgical blade. "Do you still think I need to go find another waiting room? Do you still think I am just the babysitter playing nurse?" Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek, ruining her expensive, carefully applied makeup. She slowly, painfully lowered herself downward. Her knees hit the carpet with a soft, defeated thud. She bowed her head, utterly vanquished, unable to even look me in the eye. "You are a brilliant surgeon," Beatrice whispered the admission, sounding like it physically burned her throat. "You are brilliant, and we are absolute fools. Please, Dr. Cole, please save my grandson." The picture was complete. The 3 people who had made it their life's mission to minimize my existence, to mock my career, and to treat me like a lower-class citizen were kneeling on my office floor, begging for my money and my medical expertise. I looked at their bowed heads, listening to their desperate, pathetic weeping. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no warmth. I felt only the cold, hard, unshakable satisfaction of absolute justice. I reached into my top desk drawer, pulled out the heavy multi-million-dollar financial liability waiver, and placed it flat on my leather desk pad. "I will sign this waiver," I stated, my voice ringing with icy, terrifying authority. "Because Leo is an innocent child who does not deserve to die for the sins of his profoundly incompetent parents. But understand this very clearly. You are dead to me. When this surgery is over, you will never speak to me again. You will never claim me as your family. You will walk out of this hospital and you will never look back." "Yes," Cameron sobbed instantly, nodding his head frantically, willing to agree to any condition. "Anything you want, just sign it." I picked up my heavy silver fountain pen, uncapped it, and signed my name on the dotted line, officially absorbing millions of dollars in financial liability with a single aggressive stroke of ink. I did not say another word to them. I stood up from my leather executive chair, walked around the massive mahogany desk, and stepped right past their kneeling, weeping forms. I had a patient to save. I handed the signed liability waiver to Harold Vance, who was waiting anxiously just outside the glass doors of my office, and I immediately sprinted back down the corridor toward the intensive care unit. I pushed my way back through the heavy double doors into Trauma Bay 1. The atmosphere inside the room was incredibly tense, thick with the smell of sterile prep and impending death. Leo's heart rate was severely bradycardic, dropping dangerously low on the glowing overhead monitors. His tiny chest barely moved against the aggressive force of the mechanical ventilator. The surgical team looked up at me with wide, expectant eyes, waiting for the final command. "We have absolute financial clearance," I announced, my voice cutting sharply through the cacophony of shrieking medical alarms. "Initiate the ECMO protocol right now. Hand me a scalpel." I positioned myself firmly at the head of the sterile surgical field. The bright, blinding halogen operating lights illuminated the small orange betadine-stained square on Leo's neck. I took the number 11 scalpel from the scrub technician and made a precise, flawless incision just above the right clavicle. Blood welled up instantly, bright and urgent. I used blunt dissection tools to carefully, methodically isolate the delicate internal jugular vein and the common carotid artery, separating the vital vessels from the surrounding muscle and fascia. Heparin is the patient I ordered, my eyes never leaving the surgical field. The clinical perfusionist confirmed the powerful anticoagulant was rapidly circulating through Leo's compromised bloodstream, preventing any lethal clots from forming in the plastic tubing. I clamped the tiny, fragile vessels, my hands moving with rapid mechanical perfection. I had performed this exact high-stakes cannulation hundreds of times throughout my career, but the stakes had never been this intensely, profoundly personal. I inserted the thick, life-saving plastic cannulas deep into the vessels, securing them with heavy silk sutures to ensure they would absolutely not dislodge during transport or treatment. Cannulas are secure. Unclamp the lines and initiate systemic flow, I commanded, stepping back to let the machine take over. The massive centrifugal pump on the ECMO machine roared to life with a deep, vibrating hum. Dark oxygen-starved blood flowed rapidly out of Leo's failing body, through the thick venous line, passing directly through the artificial membrane oxygenator, where it instantly turned a bright, vibrant, healthy cherry red, before being pumped forcefully back into his carotid artery, bypassing his ruined lungs entirely. Within seconds, the terrifying shrieking alarms silenced. His oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor spiked from a lethal 68% to a beautiful, perfect 99%. The horrifying blue tint vanished from his lips, and a healthy pink flush returned to his ashen cheeks. We had done it. We had successfully bypassed the drowning lungs entirely, giving his body the critical time it needed to heal. Out in the main public waiting room, the social execution of the Cole family was unfolding with brutal, poetic, and absolute justice. Cameron Whitney and Beatrice had stumbled out of the executive wing and collapsed into the hard plastic waiting room chairs, looking like shattered refugees. The wealthy investors from the lake house party, having driven to the hospital to check on the dramatic situation, were standing nearby in tailored suits and expensive summer dresses. They had overheard Harold Vance loudly confirming to the billing department that Cameron Cole was completely bankrupt, that his insurance was fake, and that Dr. Vanessa Cole had to personally guarantee the multi-million-dollar surgery out of her own immense private wealth. The scandalous whispers spread through the waiting room like a highly contagious lethal virus. The investors, men and women who despised financial weakness and fraudulent behavior above all else, looked at Cameron with sheer, unadulterated disgust. They realized the entire lake house party, the expensive champagne, the arrogant talk of yacht rentals in Monaco was a complete and utter scam, designed to steal their investment capital to cover his massive debts. One by one, they turned their backs on him. They did not offer comforting words or sympathetic hugs. They simply walked out of the sliding glass doors, silently and permanently, excommunicating the Cole family from high society forever. Beatrice watched her powerful friends leave without a backward glance, her hands shaking violently, realizing she was now a social pariah, permanently ruined, publicly humiliated, and entirely destitute. Back in the surgical wing, I stripped off my bloody surgical gown and snapped off my latex gloves, tossing them carelessly into the red biohazard bin. I washed my hands at the stainless steel scrub sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I was physically exhausted, drained to my very core from the adrenaline and the intense focus, but I had never felt more incredibly powerful in my entire life. I dried my hands, walked out of the surgical wing, and stepped into the quiet waiting room. My family looked up instantly, their eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope. Leo is successfully cannulated and fully stable on ECMO life support, I announced coldly, looking down at them. He will remain in the pediatric intensive care unit for at least 3 weeks while his lungs heal from the severe inflammatory damage, but he will survive with absolutely zero neurological deficits. Beatrice tried to stand up, reaching her arms out to hug me, tears streaming down her face as she tried to play the part of the proud mother one last time. "Oh, Vanessa, thank you. Thank you so much. You saved our family today." I stepped back instantly, holding up my hand like a solid physical barrier. "I did not save your family, Beatrice. I saved a 6-year-old boy because it is my job and my ethical duty. I paid for his life today because you and your fraudulent, pathetic son were completely incapable of doing so." I reached into my pocket and dropped the receipt copies of the financial waiver directly onto Cameron's lap. "You owe me absolutely nothing because I want absolutely nothing to do with you. This is the very last time you will ever see me. Do not call me. Do not look for me. Enjoy your bankruptcy." I turned my back on them and walked away, the sound of my footsteps echoing powerfully down the hospital corridor, leaving them to sit in the ruins of their own making, while I stepped forward into a future that belonged entirely to me. The doors of the operating theater swung shut behind me, sealing away the sterile sanctuary where I had waged a grueling war against death. My muscles ached with a deep fatigue. For 6 agonizing hours, I stood under the blinding surgical lamps, repairing the catastrophic damage inflicted upon a 6-year-old boy by his parents' absolute negligence. My scrubs were damp with sweat and stained with the chaotic reality of trauma surgery. I stripped off my gown and tossed my cap into the biohazard bin, running my hands through my flattened hair. The massive adrenaline rush that fueled my precise movements was slowly receding, leaving behind a sharp, icy clarity. I walked toward the stainless steel sink, turning the water on full blast. I washed my hands methodically, watching the soap swirl down the drain, mirroring the way my family's toxic delusions were circling the drain out in the waiting room. I did not bother to change. I wanted them to see the physical toll of the miracle they had groveled begging me to perform. I wanted the undeniable evidence of my medical expertise burned into their arrogant memories. I dried my hands, clipped my badge onto my scrub top, and began the walk down the corridor toward the waiting lounge. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was the executioner of their false reality. As I pushed through the glass doors into the waiting area, the ambient noise of the room instantly died. The space was packed with people. Cameron and Whitney were huddled together on a vinyl sofa looking like hollowed-out shells of the arrogant socialites who mocked my vintage car just hours ago. Beatrice was pacing near the observation window, clutching a cold cup of coffee. But my family members were not alone. Word of the dramatic lake house accident and the subsequent hospital confrontation had spread rapidly through their social circles. A dozen of Beatrice's wealthy country club friends and Cameron's business partners had arrived, clustering in groups in the corners. They came expecting to offer condolences to a powerful finance mogul, but instead, they spent the last several hours listening to the hospital whisper network. They knew Cameron was bankrupt. They knew his insurance was canceled. They knew the daughter Beatrice demeaned was actually the surgeon funding the entire operation. The wealthy spectators stared at me with wide eyes as I crossed the room. Their expressions were a mixture of respect and morbid curiosity. I stopped in the center of the room, folding my hands professionally. Cameron's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto my face with terror. Whitney let out a gasp. Beatrice froze mid-step, her eyes darting before settling on me. The silence was absolute. I delivered the clinical facts with the professionalism I used for any other patient's family. The surgery was successful, I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet room so every country club friend and investor could hear the medical update. Leo is stable. He has been transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit. The extracorporeal membrane oxygenation circuit is functioning perfectly, bypassing his damaged lungs and allowing the inflamed tissue to heal. He will remain heavily sedated and on life support for the next 2 weeks, but his neurological function remains intact. Because of the aggressive field resuscitation I performed on the dock, he is going to make a full and complete recovery. A collective wave of relief washed over the waiting room. Whitney collapsed against Cameron's shoulder, weeping in a performative display of maternal relief. Cameron buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. But Beatrice's reaction was different, shifting from relief to pure calculating manipulation. The moment the good news registered in her brain, her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She saw her wealthy, judgmental friends watching her every move, and her need to control the social narrative overrode her grip on reality. The groveling she had done in my executive office was suppressed. Beatrice plastered a smile across her face. She let out a sigh of joy and rushed forward across the waiting room floor, her arms outstretched as if preparing to embrace me in a hug. "Oh, Vanessa, my brilliant, wonderful girl!" Beatrice cried out, pitching her voice so the entire room could hear her shift in tone. "I knew you could do it," Beatrice continued, her eyes devoid of warmth. "I told everyone here that my daughter is the best surgeon in the state. We are so proud of you, sweetheart. Come here and let your mother hug you. You have saved our family today." I watched her approaching with disgust. The magnitude of her delusion was incredible. She believed she could publicly claim my success as her own triumph. She thought she could erase a decade of emotional abuse, humiliation, and disrespect by staging an embrace in front of her country club peers. She wanted to use my victory to repair her social standing. I did not move backward. I raised my right hand, holding my palm out flat in a gesture of rejection. "Stop right there," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, cutting authority that halted her momentum. Beatrice froze 2 feet away from me, her arms still suspended in the air, her smile faltering as she stared at my raised hand. "Do not touch me, Beatrice. Do not pretend that you have ever supported me, and do not try to use my medical achievements to salvage your reputation in front of your friends." Beatrice's face flushed a crimson red. "Vanessa, please," she hissed, trying to maintain her facade while her friends watched in silence. "People are watching us. Do not make a scene right now. We are a family." "We are not a family," I stated coldly, dropping my hand to my side. "We stopped being a family the moment you handed me plastic bibs and told your friends I was playing nurse. We stopped being a family when you spread vicious lies in a group chat while I was speeding down the highway to save your grandson's life." I reached into the deep pocket of my blue surgical scrubs and pulled out a folded stack of official hospital administration documents. The heavy white paper crinkled loudly in the suffocating, tense silence of the massive waiting room. I walked right past Beatrice, deliberately leaving her standing frozen in the very center of the floor, and stopped directly in front of Cameron and Whitney. They looked up at me with fearful, exhausted eyes, the harsh reality of their catastrophic financial ruin staring them squarely in the face. I did not hand the papers to my older brother. I simply opened my fingers and let the heavy stack of documents drop directly onto Cameron's lap. The financial liability waiver landed with a soft, definitive thud against his ruined linen pants. "Those are the finalized billing waivers," I announced, ensuring my voice carried clearly to the back of the room where his former investors stood watching. The multi-million-dollar deposit required to activate the life support machine, the massive surgical fees, the intensive care unit bed, and the specialized perfusion team. It is all paid in full. I personally guaranteed the entire amount from my own private accounts because your premium health insurance was canceled for non-payment, and your business accounts are entirely empty. Cameron stared down at the paperwork, completely unable to meet my eyes, hot tears of absolute shame leaking down his pale face. "I saved him because he is an innocent child." I continued, my voice entirely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "I saved him because he does not deserve to die just because his father is a desperate financial fraud and his mother is a negligent, status-obsessed fool. I did this for Leo, not for you, never for you." I took a slow, deliberate step back, looking at the 3 broken people who had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel incredibly small. "You owe me absolutely nothing financially," I concluded, my tone ringing with a chilling, absolute finality. "But the actual cost of this complex surgery is your complete and total absence from my personal life forever. We are done. Do not call me. Do not text me. Do not ever attempt to contact me again." I turned sharply on my heel, my surgical clogs squeaking loudly against the polished linoleum. I walked straight through the large crowd of stunned country club friends, the automatic glass doors sliding open to release me into the cool night air. I stepped firmly out of the massive hospital, completely detached from the toxic wreckage I left behind, and walked toward my vintage car. The cool evening breeze washed over my tired shoulders. My phone remained perfectly silent in my pocket. For the very first time in my life, I was finally free. 1 year later, the summer sun beat down on the city, but this time I was nowhere near a lake house. I was standing in the immaculate climate-controlled foyer of my penthouse, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored evening gown. The panoramic view of Central Park sprawled out beneath my windows, a sea of vibrant green cutting through the concrete skyline. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark, murky waters that had defined my life exactly 12 months prior. The past year had moved with the rapid, undeniable force of a seismic shift. The absolute destruction of my brother's fraudulent empire did not happen quietly. It exploded across the front pages of every major financial publication in the country. Cameron had been running a highly sophisticated, incredibly reckless Ponzi scheme, leveraging commercial real estate properties that simply did not exist. When the federal investigators finally raided his sleek downtown office, the entire illusion collapsed in a matter of hours. The lavish lakeside estate where he had mocked my vintage car was immediately seized by the bank. His luxury sports cars, the rented yachts, the designer watches, all of it was auctioned off to pay a fraction of his massive, insurmountable debts. He was currently awaiting trial, facing years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. Whitney, stripped of the wealth and status that entirely defined her fragile personality, immediately filed for divorce. She packed her bags the day the eviction notice was nailed to their front door, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive fallout of her husband's crimes. But the damage to her reputation was already permanent and absolute. Beatrice suffered perhaps the most agonizing downfall of them all. The wealthy country club friends and elite investors who had witnessed the humiliating confrontation in the Memorial Hospital waiting room did not keep their mouths shut. The Whisper Network in high society is utterly ruthless. The story of how my mother had demeaned her own daughter, the very trauma surgeon who was simultaneously saving her grandson's life and funding the multi-million-dollar operation out of pocket, spread like wildfire. Beatrice was entirely ostracized. Her country club membership was quietly revoked. Her invitations to charity galas and social luncheons instantly ceased. The women she had spent decades trying to impress now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. She lost her heavily leveraged home, her social standing, and her golden child, all in one catastrophic sweep. I did not revel in their destruction. I simply observed it from a safe, heavily fortified distance. The very day after I walked out of that hospital, I hired the most ruthless, brilliant trust and estate lawyers in the city. I established the Leo Cole Medical and Educational Trust. I funded it with a massive, impenetrable financial firewall. The legal parameters were incredibly strict and utterly ironclad. The trust would completely cover all of Leo's ongoing pulmonary rehabilitation, his regular cardiology checkups, and his future college tuition. However, Cameron, Whitney, and Beatrice were explicitly legally barred from accessing a single penny of the funds for their personal use. The money was paid directly to the medical providers and educational institutions by a neutral third-party fiduciary. I made absolutely certain that my nephew would never suffer because of his parents' catastrophic failures, but I also guaranteed that my toxic family would never be able to use the child as a pawn to manipulate my finances. I maintained a relationship with Leo through his court-appointed guardian ad litem during the divorce proceedings. I saw him for supervised visits, taking him to the museum or the park. His lungs had healed perfectly, just as I had promised they would. He was a bright, resilient boy, completely innocent in the chaotic war zone his parents had created. But aside from my carefully regulated interactions with my nephew, the boundary I drew was absolute. I changed my personal phone number. I instructed the security team at my penthouse to deny entry to anyone sharing my last name. I filed a preemptive cease and desist order through my legal team, ensuring that Beatrice and Cameron understood that any attempt to harass me at the hospital would be met with immediate aggressive police intervention. They were completely permanently excised from my reality. I had excised a malignant tumor from my life, and the subsequent healing was nothing short of miraculous. Without the constant suffocating weight of their criticism, their demands and their relentless belittling my career and my personal peace skyrocketed. I turned away from the sprawling view of Central Park and walked toward the full-length mirror in my hallway. The woman staring back at me was virtually unrecognizable from the exhausted, beaten-down clinic nurse my family had tried to project onto me. I wore a stunning floor-length emerald green gown that draped perfectly against my frame. My hair was professionally styled, and a delicate diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. Tonight was the annual National Trauma and Critical Care Symposium. I was the guest of honor. The medical board had unanimously selected me to receive the prestigious Vanguard Award for Surgical Innovation, recognizing the specialized patented pediatric instruments I had designed and my flawless surgical success rate over the past calendar year. I grabbed my clutch, walked out of my penthouse, and took the private elevator down to the lobby, where a black car was waiting to drive me to the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The moment I stepped through the gilded doors of the ballroom, I was enveloped in an atmosphere of genuine, hard-earned respect. The room was packed with the most brilliant medical minds in the country. There were no fake investors here. There were no leveraged socialites judging people by the brand of their shoes. These were men and women who fought death on a daily basis, who understood the profound, crushing weight of holding a human heart in their hands. As I made my way toward the front of the room, I saw my reserved table. This was my true family. Sitting there looking incredibly sharp in a tailored tuxedo was Dr. Thomas Arrington. He stood up immediately, pulling out my chair with a warm, genuine smile. Next to him was Brenda, the veteran triage nurse who had stonewalled my family's ridiculous demands, looking beautiful in a deep red dress. My chief surgical residents, my brilliant perfusionist, and the entire core trauma team who had stood beside me in the operating room that night were all gathered around the table. They raised their glasses in a silent, respectful toast as I took my seat. They knew me. They valued me. They respected my leadership and my skill without any toxic conditions or hidden agendas attached. They were the family I had chosen, the family I had earned through mutual respect and shared sacrifice in the trenches of the trauma bay. The master of ceremonies approached the podium, his voice echoing across the quiet, attentive ballroom. We are here tonight to honor a physician whose dedication to pediatric cardiothoracic surgery has completely redefined the standard of care in emergency medicine, the announcer stated clearly. Her innovative techniques have saved thousands of lives. Her leadership at Memorial Hospital is nothing short of legendary. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Vanessa Cole. The entire ballroom erupted into thunderous standing applause. Thomas leaned over, giving my shoulder a firm, proud squeeze. I stood up from the table, smoothing the emerald fabric of my gown. As I reached for my clutch to set it on my chair, the screen of my phone illuminated brightly through the sheer mesh fabric of the small bag. A text message notification popped up on the lock screen. It was from an unknown number, but the desperate, chaotic tone of the message was instantly painfully familiar. The text read, "Vanessa, please. It is your mother. I had to borrow a phone. They are foreclosing on my apartment tomorrow. Cameron is going to jail. I have absolutely nothing left. I know we made mistakes, but you are rich now. You have millions. You cannot just leave your own mother on the street. Please, I am begging you. Just a small loan, for family." I stared down at the glowing screen for exactly 3 seconds. The noise of the applauding ballroom seemed to fade into a distant muffled hum. I felt a brief, tiny echo of the old guilt, the lifelong conditioning that demanded I sacrifice my own well-being to save the very people who had tried to destroy me. But the echo was faint, powerless, and instantly silenced by the crushing, undeniable truth of everything I had survived. I did not type a response. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply unlocked my phone, tapped the unknown number, and firmly pressed block. I stepped right up to the wooden podium, smiling entirely and wonderfully free. If there is one profound lesson I have learned from walking away from my toxic family, it is that your true worth is never determined by the people who actively refuse to see it. For a decade, I allowed my mother and brother to cast me as the disappointing babysitter, playing nurse simply because my path didn't involve their flashy, leveraged illusion of success. I thought my silence and distance would protect me, but it only emboldened their arrogance and cruelty. The ultimate turning point wasn't when I saved my nephew's life in that dark lake, or even when the chief of medicine proudly called me doctor, in front of them, completely shattering their pathetic delusion. The real victory was the quiet, unshakable moment I realized that I didn't need their validation to know my own brilliance. Blood relations do not give anyone a free pass to disrespect, demean, or diminish your hard-earned achievements. True independence is built on a solid foundation of absolute self-respect. When you stop desperately seeking the approval of people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you free up your energy to build an empire of your own making. You must surround yourself with found family, colleagues, and friends who celebrate your victories, respect your strict boundaries, and value you for exactly who you are without any toxic strings attached. Sometimes, the most powerful act of self-love is simply walking away from a table where respect is no longer being served, blocking out the noise and stepping into the beautiful, peaceful life you earned with your own two hands. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with family members who severely underestimated your worth? How did you find the courage to finally walk away and choose your own peace? Share your experiences in the comments below. If my journey to true independence resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to join a community of people reclaiming their power. Remember, your success is your best armor, and your peace is always worth protecting.